Discusiones que sostengamos aquí seguro nos inspirarán a actuar con visión y determinación. Los invito a cruzar juntos estos puentes hacia el 2030, puentes que nos conecten con la innovación, la sostenibilidad y el progreso de nuestra región. Ahora cedo la palabra a Iker Zubizarreta, director financiero del FLAR, quien nos presentará en detalle los objetivos y la estructura del evento que tenemos por delante. Muchas gracias.
Good morning, buenos días. Muchas gracias, Dr. Uribe, por esas inspiradoras palabras de apertura. Many thanks, Dr. Uribe, for those very kind and inspiring opening words. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for making the effort to accompany us these days in Cartagena. We know your busy agenda. We know that many of you have several time zones of difference, so that makes it even more of an appreciation in that regard. Wanted to make a special mention to TradeWeb. They have agreed to co-sponsor the dinner for tonight. So first of all, last year, you notice at some point I was speaking in Finnish and in Mandarin and in Arabic and so on. That was all due to the magic of technology and all these AI wonderful things that come up. So this year we couldn't do less. So we have prepared a small audio. There is this tool in a Google, it's a Google notebook, and then you put whatever, a link or a PDF or what have you, and then they come up with these wonderful narratives that make you look like a rock star. So if we can play that audio for the audience team, please. Michelle? Or not? Felipe, el audio, ¿están en eso? Okay, here we go. ¿No se oye?
Everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're looking ahead into the future of finance with a pretty fascinating conference put on by the Latin American Reserve Fund.
Yeah, and it's coming up in 2024.
It is, and they've called it Bridges to 2030, vision towards a disruptive.
That.
I mean,
Bridges to 20.
yeah, and it really seems to be all about, figuring out how to build this path
Right.
from where we are now to 2025.
Yeah.
There to 2030.
That's right. So they've really broken it down into those two kind of key segments, right?
Exactly.
Building the bridge to 2025 and then extending that bridge all the way to 2030.
Love that. And it looks like, based on everything I've seen about this conference, it's really focused on two main things. First, understanding those macroeconomic trends.
Yes.
And then diving deep into financial innovation.
Right. So it's kind of like, here's the landscape, and here are the tools that we can use
Exactly.
to navigate.
All right, so let's dive into data.
Okay.
The morning session is all about building that initial bridge to 2025. And they're specifically looking at the impact of the U.S. election.
Then in the afternoon, things shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
We're extending the bridge all the way to 2030.
So this is like the second part.
It is the second part.
And this is where I think it gets really exciting.
All right, I like this. So what are we talking about?
This is where they dive headfirst into financial innovation.
Okay, so we're talking like fintech,
Yeah, AI, all that stuff.
the future of finance.
Yeah, and it's all about modernizing the financial sector.
Okay, what about day two?
Day two is a little bit different.
Okay, how so?
It's a bit more exclusive. The closed door session, specifically for official institutions.
Oh, interesting.
So central banks from across the region coming together to strategize and really tackle
Yeah.
the key issues facing Latin American economies.
So this is like the behind the scenes work.
Yeah.
That goes into building that stable bridge to the future.
Exactly. You know what strikes me about this whole conference
What's that?
is that the Latin American Reserve Fund isn't just talking about the future.
Right.
They're actively working to shape it.
Yeah.
They're embracing innovation
Yeah.
while still recognizing, the importance of those foundational macroeconomic forces.
And then you gotta have both.
You do, and they're creating a space for dialogue, for collaboration,
Yeah,
which I think we need more of these days.
absolutely. I totally agree. And this isn't just a conversation for financial experts.
No, it's not.
It's something we should all be thinking about,
For sure.
right? What innovations are you most excited about, or maybe even a little bit wary of? How will these changes in the financial world impact your investments, your future? It's a bridge we're all building together one step at a time.
I like that. That's a good way to put it.
Yep. Thank you. Well, how about that? Certainly did a better job than I could ever expect to do, and make it look very, very exciting. So, interesting thing about this tool is it's robots. So there's no human involved. You just put your link, your PDF, as I mentioned, and then they come up with these narratives. One thing I did with the tool, I put my LinkedIn profile, and boy, do I look like a rock star. It is amazing. It's so I do recommend that. And if you are ever feeling low in the morning or so, just play it, and you feel like you own the planet. So enough of that. I do think that lays of the foundations of the agenda and what we'll be looking for. So in my first slide, those of you that follow me in LinkedIn do know that I did the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, this year. And this was a deeply profound experience for me. And along the way in this path, there are lots of bridges and churches and castles, Gothic cathedrals and the like. And it did give me a lot of perspective. It made me, feel humble about all that has preceded us. So there I am in the bridge of La Reina. If you have seen the movie The Way by Emilio Estevez, it is wonderful. I recommend it. And in that bridge, some interesting things happen. So there I am with my wife. We did it with my wife and a couple of friends. So talking more about bridges and bridges that are special to me, there are bridges of all kinds. And this is proof of it. Those of you that may have gone to Bilbao, Spain, at the end of the river, there is this bridge, and that carriage that goes across takes cars and people and so on. So that's a bridge, but very, very different as well. For me, this is a special place. That's where my family comes from in Bilbao, and just 10 blocks from there, that's where my cousins and uncles live. And then other special bridges. There's a lot of noise. So that was too much noise. But the idea, those are other kinds of bridges going across in the jungle in Costa Rica. My wife hates those. She hates heights. But at some point you come in the path where there's really nothing you can do. Either you walk back 10 miles or you go across. So that's talking about bridges. And then this bridge, I think, brings us to the kind of subjects that we are aiming to talk about these days. We know that there is a bridge there, but certainly cannot see the beginning or the end. And I do feel that represents the way that many of us feel. Certainly, that's how I feel about many of these subjects that we will be talking about today. So we are going to be doing an exercise. Please scan this QR code. And there will be, we will be filling a word cloud, answering the question on what keeps you up at night. It is a common question that never grows old. And so we'll give it a minute or so and see how the word cloud begins to populate. So we'll give it a couple minutes. I still see some cell phones trying to scan the code. And all right. Let's see. All right. Exciting Trump, polarization, geopolitical. Let's see. Inflation. Football, okay. Populism. Football keeps you up at night. I'd like to hear about that one over dinner. Geopolitical risk, war, peace. Kids. How about jet lag? populism, rates, Trump and Trump and Trump, geopolitical polarization. I think the panel this morning is going to have a field day with this. My daughter, exciting work, okay, that's a good one. Baby, Russia nuclear warheads, that should keep a lot of people awake. Let's see. Well, you can put more, you don't have to just put one word, but so unless there's only one thing that keeps you awake. But okay, well, I do think that we get an idea of where this is going to. So one thing that I'm gonna put a slide here. Okay, so one thing I did, I had a conversation with GPT about this session, the conference agenda and the like, and then I told GPT and with my thoughts, create a word cloud on this subject. So it does ring many bells on all these geopolitics, on Trump, polarization, cybersecurity, technology, crypto, quantum, Ukraine, disruption, autocracy, artificial intelligence, climate change. I don't think I'm missing any. And then, so these are the broad themes about it. This image, what I did in GPT, I put these 6 bullets, and I told the GPT to create an image, and it came up with this. It looks like something that could be in some gallery. But point about it, certainly we are in sync with all these geopolitics, global tensions, the politics and polarization, economic and demographic issues, environmental and the like, security and defense. These are subjects that certainly will be spoken in the morning and throughout the conference. Technology and disruption, the afternoon will be heavy on this. So we already looked at the agenda, and by seeing these word clouds, we have seen that there are many different kinds of bridges. And this is no exception. So they come, you know, like the one over the Thames, and then this is a Chinese, somewhere in China probably. She knows about, well, you're from Hong Kong, but you may know about that. So we'll be talking about many different things from where we are to where we have to go, and then how to build these connections in between these elements. And hopefully by tomorrow, as the friends from the podcast said, it will be about collaboration, it will be about connection, about building these bridges with tangible actions, and hopefully by the end of the conference, we'll have at least in mind something that looks like this: clear sky, smooth seas, and a clear path towards our future for this 2030. So without any further do's, I will be talking about a bit about what lays ahead for this afternoon, or this morning, sorry. So up until the coffee break, we will have our colleagues that have been kind enough to join us in the conference. As the first session will be led by Robert Abad. I'll be reading the titles just to make sure I don't miss anything. He's a product strategy for the global EM and multi-asset credit. So many thanks to Robert and to Alfredo for coming to Cartagena. Then we will be having Andy and Frank. Andy is, let me see here, the Global Head of Public Affairs and Strategic Investments at Invesco. So many thanks to Andy and to Rod. Next we'll have Frank Kelly, Senior Strategist at DWS. Many thanks to Frank and to Mary. And then in the final component, we'll have Achilo, Senior Economist for BNP Paribas Asset Management. So many thanks to Chi and to Kara. So without any further comments, I cede the floor to Robert Abad. He's our Master of Ceremonies for the rest of the morning. One additional comment. They will have some 20 minutes to lay their thoughts and ideas. And then after the coffee break, they will convene in a panel, and then there will be plenty of questions for them. So if in these segments you don't get to ask your questions and the like, don't worry about it. And then as an additional element, I will be joining that panel. So thank you so much, and Robert, the floor is yours.
And so this is a plot device that we've seen time and time again. Even in modern times, we'll have someone like John Wick get some last-second help. In this particular case, a blind man who happens to be an expert with swords and guns. But the idea of a deus ex machina is ultimately that we have like a happy ending, right? We have something that makes the story flow, and we feel satisfied. And as a reader or as a film goer, this plot device actually works. In some cases, we may be satisfied with the outcome. In some cases, we might think it's a little bit too much. But at the end of the day, in 2 hours or an hour and 30 minutes, we're done with the movie, or in a couple of days, we're done with the book. But markets don't like unanticipated events, and certainly do not like surprise elements that come out of the blue that disturbs a narrative. So in a year where almost half of the world's population went to vote, I think you can all appreciate, if you've been following the headlines, that there have been a couple of surprise moments. So on this slide, what you have on the left is a situation where for some time there was expectations that the Indian government would achieve a supermajority in its election, which would allow the government to push through what we consider to be contentious economic reforms. And at the last second, when everyone went to vote, the outcome was the opposite. And we saw the reaction of the market from the equity standpoint and also from the rupee standpoint. On the right-hand side, people really expected Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico to win the presidential election, but no one really anticipated a supermajority outcome that would introduce the possibility of, again, contentious judicial reforms that at the end of the day would be deemed to be business unfriendly. So in both cases, these were surprise outcomes in key elections. And needless to say, we had the situation in the United States, where obviously there was a Trump victory, and I think this was somehow well telegraphed. And since all of us in the US are familiar with the idea of tariffs and the potential for more extended tax cuts and what have you, the market in the US responded positively. You see here the post-election reaction versus the European stock market, basically signaling the idea that, well, with more deregulation of the financial sector, oil and gas companies, and so forth, we should see a positive reaction going forward with financial markets in the US. On the flip side, you see the reaction of the emerging world, obviously reflecting concerns over tariff, the potential for trade war, and so forth. So these are kind of like the surprise elements or unanticipated factors that you could say are driving momentum in financial markets. But when we think about economics, economics is not a one or two act play. Think of it as a series of acts moving along. And if you look at this chart here, going back to 2017, US economy really absorbed the blows of the initial round of the Trump tariffs, lower tax cuts, some geopolitical conflict. You had some noise around China. But here we were moving along until COVID hit. Obviously, a tremendous unanticipated event, roiled financial markets, roiled our lives. Of course, years go by, and here we are, where the debate now is whether we're having either a soft landing or potentially no landing. And so the question is, what has contributed to this economic resiliency? At Western Asset, we think the consumer has been a very important, buoyant factor in all this. And so here you see a scoreboard of how we think about various economic factors. Very straightforward. Whether you look at employment, you look at consumer spending, real income growth, and so on, these factors have been stabilizing and ultimately providing some kind of a tailwind to the economy. Nothing you don't understand. But here's something we have to ask. When we do a little bit of research on the benefits of immigration on an economy, especially the US, maybe there are three things we can draw from that research. One is that more immigration leads to a bigger labor pool, more consumption, more tax revenue. So the question is, if we now have a period with this new Trump administration where we may see lower immigration in the form of deportations, how will the US economy respond to that? And how will rate markets respond to the idea of extended corporate tax cuts or more fiscal pressure? We've seen a tremendous amount of rate volatility over the past 3 years. There are concerns about our deficit in the US, concern about our debt levels, the strength of the US dollar. How will rate markets respond to this new era, this Trump 2.0 era? And then we think about the bigger picture. We step back. And I love this slide because basically what it shows here is the economic weight of the developed world versus the emerging world. And so what you have here is the G7 in blue and the BRICS in red. And essentially what it shows that over time, maybe sometime in 2040, the emerging world will overtake the developed world in terms of its economic force, right? In terms of its weight on the global economy. But what this chart masks is a tremendous tension that's happening between these two worlds. The fight for water, the fight for land, the fight for energy resources, the fight for technology, the fight for market share. And so it begs the question, given that backdrop, and given news, for example, overnight, that Russia just launched an ICBM against the Ukraine, or that the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant against Netanyahu, and other headlines that just keep popping up, it begs the question, what will happen once the tariffs that Trump has proposed really take force? If you look at the graph on the top, it shows you that in 2016, as these tariffs first started to roll out in the first Trump administration, the Chinese authorities allowed the exchange rate to depreciate. And in doing so, somewhat countered the effect of the US tariffs as they started to ratchet higher. And so it begs the question, what will be the response this time around when the proposed tariffs are not expected to be around 25%, but 60%? What will happen as we continue to ratchet higher this time around? And when we think about the response of the Chinese exchange rate, if it depreciates, what kind of effects will it have on the Asia region? What kind of pressure or upward pressure will this put on the US dollar? What will that mean for the rest of the world? If we see a scenario where we have a slowdown in demand, What will that mean for oil markets, which are reflected at the bottom? U.S. oil production is at an all-time high. Will the Saudis respond in a very competitive manner by also increasing their supply to put some U.S. oil producers out of business? We don't know, but what will a lower oil price outlook mean for Latin America? And on one hand, and pardon me if I didn't change the slide sooner, but this is the chart on the top was the tariff impact in 2016 with the declining exchange rate. The bottom is the oil price movement, U.S. in blue, in orange the Saudi crude oil production. And what does all this mean for Latin America? Interestingly enough, if we have a scenario of higher tariffs against a backdrop where the Chinese have built up very strong trade relationships with Latin America, will those relationships only get stronger in this new Trump era? In 2014, a film came out called Ex Machina. Now, the director never really provided a meaning for the title of his movie, but one could interpret this as maybe the godless machine. And in this film, the storyline simply is that a young man wins a lottery to spend a week with a genius computer scientist. And his job is to do a Turing test, check to see whether or not a creation that he has made is able to fool a human into thinking that it's not this AI android. Now, the story is very interesting. I would highly recommend that you see it. But it poses the question of whether or not what we create can also ultimately be disappointed in us. Not necessarily turn against us, but perhaps have pity on us. Now, this movie was made in 2014, 4 years before the first announcement of GPT, an AI model used to train what we now use as ChatGPT. And so, when we think about and we make this pivot toward this discussion of AI, let's remember a little bit, let's go down memory lane and remember the first reaction to the internet. And some of these headlines reflect that. We're going down a very different path today. We are happy to embrace this ChatGPT. We find it curious. We find it interesting. We want to play with it. And I think the market has basically reflected that curiosity, that endless possibility of what it can do. When we look at just the growth of tech companies in this area, again, think about the title here. If you blink, you miss it. The last 5 years have been spectacular for these companies. But look at the size of these participants. Their market capitalizations are at or near or potentially above the GDP of certain countries. So, are there lines blurring between nations and corporations? Is a question we should be thinking about. So what are the perceived benefits of AI? If we look at this survey here, you have all kinds of answers. But the number one answer is an increase in productivity. Okay. But is AI really the answer to boosting productivity? If we look at productivity rates on the left-hand side, what you see here is that information and communication and technology gains during the 2001-2007 period, that boom period. Yes, we saw a boom, but it hasn't been sustained. And researchers are still trying to figure out why. And relative to the long-term rate of productivity, the question is, will AI really boost productivity? Still don't know. But let's look at the right-hand side of this chart. What we do know is that the adoption rate for the newer technologies is much faster, greater than technologies introduced in the past. Okay, so maybe a little bit difficult to read, but when you think about how long it took for people, or the penetration rate for automobiles or electric power, radio, even the washing machine, this took some time. But things like the internet, smartphones, cell phones, faster adaptation rates. So that could be a positive. But bear in mind that the ones that will probably benefit the most from AI at this point are those countries with a strong digital infrastructure and where jobs are most exposed to AI. Now, it's very important to understand that this race for AI needs three things. You need faster chips. You need more chips. And if you look at the left-hand side of this slide, what you have here in that top bar is the US making a very, very aggressive push into trying to build up semiconductor capacity at home. And obviously that's going to put tension on what's happening with semiconductor supply provided by countries around the world. So we need more chips, and we need more speed to keep up with demand. But something to keep in mind, and this is extremely important, is to consider the bottom right graphic, the need for energy. So when we look at this chart, what do we have here? We have here the data centers that basically power all this work, all those searches that you do, all those podcasts that you create transcripts of. Anything that you do, images, film, whatever, take up energy. So we combine the use of AI, or let's say things like ChatGPT, and you tack on crypto activity, Bitcoin mining activity. This consumes a tremendous amount of electricity. And so what does that mean exactly? I think this chart is very interesting. Here we have ChatGPT's energy consumption by different time periods. So this is as of June 2024. The number of prompts in the green on a daily basis, at least based on this count, 428 million prompts. Over a year, 156 billion prompts. The point is that this number keeps rising as more and more people are curious. And they want to understand what's going on here. I heard my friend talking about this. Let me try this. Let me try that. More companies start to adopt this tool. But look at energy consumption in the mustard yellow. Look how it just keeps ramping higher and higher and higher in terms of kilowatt. Kilowatts are basically, think about a 100-watt light bulb running for 10 hours. So here we have the search engine, you could say manifestation in terms of energy use, in that range of 453 million kilowatts, used up in a year. And of course, the associated cost of providing that energy. So this is a cost that continues rising. So you might say, Robert, okay, explain to me this whole thing about energy consumption. Well, let's put it in a different plane. The amount of electricity that ChatGPT uses to respond to prompts would, as you see in this chart here, charge every electric vehicle in the US 2 times, power over 43,000 US households, charge almost 96 million cell phones, and supply electricity to Austria for 2 days and a half. The point here is that, do we have enough electrical demand, or supply rather, to meet this demand? This electricity just doesn't come from anywhere. And what charges electricity, or what powers electricity, are either coal or natural gas grids. And so the question is, where do we build these? Where do we put them? And what is the net impact ultimately on global sustainability in a time when climate finance right now is under assault? So we talked about a deus ex machina, an ex machina, and the last thing I would consider here are just machinations. And ultimately, what does this mean? It means the use of AI and its impact on socio-political risk. Social media has introduced so much volatility in terms of opinion, introduced a tremendous amount of polarization. This morning, we were just sitting around a table and we're looking at these headlines. Everyone has an opinion based on these headlines. So what is the impact of AI on top of all of this? what will it do for us as a society? I know my children are impacted by what they read on their phones. And they bring that home. They share what their friends are saying. These things cannot be lost in translation. And you look at this survey, yes, there's concerns about whether it might centralize power if AIs or ChatGPT or all these models are used by the wrong actors. And there's concern about potentially this technology affecting income inequality. We don't have the answers for this, but clearly this goes into the realm of ethics and regulation. This particular survey struck me as interesting. Basically says here, when you did a survey across 29 countries, that people feel artificial intelligence will make it easier to generate fake news. I think we've all lived through this. We're seeing this live. Obviously, this impacts disinformation and misinformation. These are things that we know, we are living with. So there are benefits, there are perceived benefits, but there are also concerns around the use of technology. But when we bring it back to markets, the question is whether or not we are really factoring everything that we need to understand. What does that mean? When we look at the equity market in the United States right now, we've been up 33% in 1 year, about 24% year to date. Tech stocks are flying higher. At the same time, we have US interest rates ratcheting higher as well. Something has to give. And so the question is, are markets also looking for a deus ex machina? Are they looking for maybe some catalyst, like the midterm elections? Are they looking for maybe a stimulus package from China to dictate which way the markets will go? Perhaps we'll have another breakthrough in AI technology. Maybe that pushes equity markets higher. But right now, the way we see it is things seem a little bit too perfect. And so all of us here, again, asset managers, reserve managers, all of us here have a responsibility to stay ahead of the news. All of us here have to try to figure out narratives. Where are they headed? And all of us have to consider whether there might be surprises, unanticipated events, surprise elements. It's not easy. But if there's one thing we've learned over the last 5 years, and again, I just mentioned 5 years because all of us are battle tested. We've been doing this 20, 30 plus years, is that there's an evolutionary process underway when it comes to economics, politics, and technology. But if there's a key takeaway from these comments, just to open up our session, is that there really are no shortcuts in any place that's worth going. So please keep that in mind as we move deeper into 2025. Those are my opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Can everyone hear me? Great. Good morning. Try that again. Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm going to do you a favor here. I'm going to put a little timer here because I'm from Washington, D.C., and we like to talk a lot. So I'm going to limit how much I talk and hopefully have enough time for some questions. I have a slide deck that I'm going to give you just a portion of and skip around, so please forgive me for that. But it's really great to be here. I think this is a very rich discussion. Robert, thank you so much for opening us up here. I'm looking forward to our panel discussion. So be ready to ask questions. If you have a question, just let me know in between. That's fine, or in the panel. Let's see. Do I have my presentation in here, or is it not here? If it's not, I can do it myself. No? Okay, that's fine. I'll do it without the visual. So a couple things I want to go through. let's start with just a couple tools that you can use. For those who've heard me speak before, I like to start off with this concept of 3 words: politics trumps policy. I'll say it again: politics trumps policy. And yes, I use the trumps because Trump is president. It makes sense. But the concept there is that when you're trying to figure out what's actually going to happen from a policy perspective, you have to look at the politics. The politics are going to mandate what happens on policy. You can have the best policy idea in the world, but unless you make it good politics, it has no future or longevity. So, break that down. There's 2 parts of the politics that you need to look at. Number 1, you need to look at the macro politics. Is it 50, 60, 70, 80% popular in the country you're talking about? I think it was Abraham Lincoln talked about with public sentiment you can do anything, without public sentiment you can do nothing. And then on the micropolitics side is important too. Who's making the decision? Does the President of the United States get to make the decision by himself? Does a singular regulator get to make that decision? Is it the U.S. Congress? Is it the Senate? Is it some other entity? And you have to look at the politics there. And the best example I can think of for micropolitics would be, hold on a second, just make sure. I've got that timer working. Okay, it is working. You're safe. Is that what's the personal self-interest of that one person? So I'm going to make a statement. I'm not trying to make a value judgment on this. I'm just trying to do a political analysis. So we saw October 7th of last year, the horrific attacks on Israel. We were very clear on the fact that once Netanyahu started his aggression on Gaza, he was not going to stop. Why? His micropolitics. If he stopped the aggression, he would lose the support of the right wing of the Israeli government, and he would be out of power. And he would not only be out of power, he'd be at the risk of going to jail. Nothing focuses the mind like getting out of power and going to jail. Very simplistic analysis, but it's come true. Now it's a new world with Donald Trump as president. He may have another path, but we saw no way, no matter how much President Biden or foreign leaders went after him, there was nothing in it for him to stop. So that's just that example. So that's the politics trumps policy. Please pay attention to that when you're analyzing anything. The second thing I want to talk about is just what about the U.S. political environment, what's created it, but I think there's some same examples that you can take in your countries as well. So the first thing with that I would like to say is that I believe that the inputs determine the outputs. How we receive information determines how we react, our opinions, and how we go forward. So over time, we've had, Gutenberg and the printing press, newspapers, where they would, be disseminated, and that would influence, how people think. Then we went to radio and then television. I'm a Gen Xer. So if you're a Gen Xer or a baby boomer in the United States, where did you get your news in the 70s and 80s? You got it from ABC, NBC, CBS, the 3 networks. Very curated news, not much different, pretty similar. And so when you disagreed with someone, you didn't disagree with them out here, you just disagreed with them out here. It was pretty contained. I differ with you. Very polite, very civilized, relatively speaking. Then in the 80s and in the 90s, we started with MSNBC and Fox. So we got to choose, okay, which side are you on? That's all I want to hear. I don't want to hear the other stuff. But it still was pretty curated. It wasn't too far out. Well, with the internet, what we've been able to do is we've been able to go all the way to, you can pick anything you want on social media. And there are thousands of curators of news. And you join that with AI, when you do your little search on Google or somewhere else, you say, oh, I like this. Oh, you like that? Oh, we'll give you this. Oh, let's give you some more of that, and you're over here. The other person types in, oh, you like that? You like that? You're over here. And you are in 2 separate worlds. The late Senator Patrick Moynihan from New York used to say, "You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts." That is no longer. Because when you're in your little community, not only do you get to express your opinion, you get confirmation bias, you get a whole set of facts and reinforcement and a community to agree with you and reinforce it and strengthen your conviction. And it gets to the point where it's not only that you disagree with the person on the other side, you think they're stupido, dumb, you even think they're evil, and in America they're un-American and they don't deserve to live. And this is the level of our debate in the United States. This is not, I'm not making this up. But it's fueled by these two different worlds that people live in, where they're never faced with any other information that confronts their belief system. And I'll give you an example of why. During the campaign, we had Hurricane Helene. And on the same day, you had Donald Trump saying, President Biden is not helping the state of Georgia. He has not talked to Governor Kemp. This is ridiculous. And then you have Governor Kemp doing a press conference where he's saying, I just talked to President Biden. He's been very helpful. I will let him know if I need his help. And you're thinking, oh, President Trump, he's lied in real time. This is clearly going to be, most people are going to figure that out. And normally when there's a lie, it has a head start, but the truth catches up, and probably 70, 80% figure it out because they're being given the truth to counter the lie. And that's normally what it works. Do you know what the poll said a week and a half after that day where that lie was said? 83% of Republicans who are in this little world believe President Trump. Why? Because either that news never reached them, or if it did, it didn't match their belief system and they kicked it out. So that's the world that we're living in, and that explains a lot of the contentiousness in our political system, and it has the potential for great harm. Some people would say the other side, great good, but in this instance, we may not have a shared truth, and if you don't have a shared truth, it's going to be that much harder to come together. So, and it's pretty much a split country, so you're going to see ebb and flow, and I think most prognosticators would agree that in 2 years in our midterm elections in the U.S., we're likely to put a check on Donald Trump. So he knows he has 2 years, and so he's going to be very, very aggressive in putting forth the policies he thought he was elected on. And just we'll talk about this later, and I know Frank has some ideas too, but the issues in any election, let me say how much time I have just so I know if I can go. Okay, good, I have time. When I look at an election, I look at it through the lens of Maslow's hierarchy of needs from your college psychology course. So just to refresh, Maslow's theory was there's certain basic needs that you need to take care of first before I'm even going to worry about the higher needs. So the first two are, am I safe? Physical security? And can I eat? And today that would be financial security. Now, if those are taken care of, I can think about the arts, I can think about this, I can do all kinds of things. But if I don't know if I'm going to be alive tomorrow, or if I'm going to be able to eat tomorrow, I can't hear you. I cannot hear you because my daily existence is at risk. And so there's a great poll that comes out every January, February by Pew Research Center, and it's called America's Top Priorities. And they basically do a poll and say, okay, list all your top priorities, and they rank them based on the percentage of people who claim that. And invariably, the top two include physical security and financial security, terrorism, and the economy. So let's go back to 2020, January. What were the two top things? Terrorism and the economy. And Then you had COVID happen in March of 2020. And so COVID replaced terrorism as the top physical security, am I going to live tomorrow issue. And so while even in that poll, it showed that Donald Trump was more trusted to bring back the economy after COVID, Joe Biden was trusted more to deal with COVID. And that's why he won that election. The reason I'm going through that process with you is to fast forward to 2024 to analyze what just happened. If you look at that same poll in February of 2024, the top two issues were economy and terrorism. What's not there? COVID. So it makes sense that but for COVID, Trump didn't win in 2020, that in 2024, he led the polls from, I think, March or April of 2023, until he won. Why? Because COVID wasn't there and he was trusted more on the economy. And my thesis is that this election, where there's a lot of things that happened, was done 9 months ago. 9 months ago, people made up their mind because the number one issue was financial security, the economy, and I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, but the numbers were great. GDP growth was amazing. America's doing better than the rest of the world. I don't care about the rest of the world if I'm making $30,000 a year, feeding a family of four, and I have inflation, not annual year-over-year inflation, cumulative inflation where my prices are 20, 30, 40% higher than they were before, and I have to make a choice when I go to the grocery store. Or when I can't get the car loan for the car that I need to get to and forth to work, or I can't get a mortgage because mortgage interest rates are up because the Fed has increased rates. I don't care because my life right now is hard. You tack on immigration, where immigration numbers skyrocketed in the U.S., and immigration is a proxy for both physical security, who's in our country, do I know them, are they committing crimes, and financial security, are they taking my jobs, are they competing with me? So it's a very powerful emotional issue that people feels like impacts them greatly. And so those issues were baked in from the very start. Now, we had abortion as an issue, very important issue in the U.S., but if I don't have these other two, it's secondary. And so when I look at that, I say that the cake was baked 9 months ago, and if you look at some of the post-election numbers, they will back that up. So we changed candidates, we had a debate, we had 34 felony, we had all that stuff, but at the end of the day, if you look at those making $30,000 to $50,000, and those making $50,000 to $100,000 a year, they went from voting for Biden in 2020 to flipping and voting for Trump in 2024. Why? Because the inflation, that affordability index, impacted them. They were the ones most acutely affected by inflation. They couldn't afford to live at the level they need to live. But guess what happened to those making $100,000 to $200,000 and those making $200,000 and above? They switched from Donald Trump to Kamala Harris. So to me, that says yes, it's annoying. I have to spend a little more, but it's not going to really impact my life as much. And so I'm going to vote on abortion. I'm going to vote on this. I'm going to vote on these other things that are as important but aren't life and death today. And I know that abortion is life and death in some respects. I'm not discounting that. There's reasons for why people voted that way. My point is that inflation and the immigration were the top two issues. And then there were some other cultural, ethnic issues thrown in there. But that door for those cultural, ethnic issues is not opened if people feel safe and if they feel like they can live the economic life that they want to live. And so that's kind of the gist there. Now let me see if I have time to just have a few minutes here. Going forward, so I hinted at the fact that Donald Trump is going to try to fulfill some of his promises. The promises I feel he's going to most go after are tariffs and immigration on one side of the ledger, and then he's going to go after tax cuts and deregulation on the other side of the ledger. Now, taxes and deregulation are pro-growth, but they're going to be delayed. They're not happening right away. Tax cuts going to expire at the end of the year. It's going to take to the end of the year to get that redone and add any new tax cuts you want to tax. You're not going to get that stimulus until the end of the year. Deregulation, normally it takes time to put in the new people in the regulatory agencies, come up with your plan, do it, comment period, and all that. So that's most likely to take some time. However, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal today that I will point you to by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, talking about their plan to use the Chevron case in the Supreme Court to expedite that and get rid of some extra regulatory action beyond Congress. That's going to be played out, and if they are successful in that, they will get a rocket boost to the deregulatory manner, but it will still be tested in court, so we'll see that. But then the thing that's more immediate are tariffs, because he's going to want to say something day one on that. But if he says something day one, he still won't be able to implement it, because if he uses Section 301, he has to do an investigation, he has to do a report, and then he can implement it. So you're not talking summer, you're talking summer to fall at the most, even if he moves at breakneck speed. But the fact that he's going to announce things on day one, that's going to create volatility in the market just like it did 4 years ago, or when his first term. And then immigration. So I'm going to break that into two parts, and it's tied to tariffs in one sense. And that is that on day one, he will have a bunch of executive orders re-implementing some of the things that we talked about that he did the first term, and potentially some new things, which one will really stop the inflow or hurt the inflow tremendously, day one. On the outflow, as far as deportations, that takes time, that's delayed. You have to get the infrastructure together, you have to put detention centers, it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of commitment. But there's one part he could do, this has been talked about, which is to take those undocumented workers and make them unhireable by having the Justice Department and other officials say, we're going to prosecute you for not knowing whether your workers are documented or not. You are complicit, which we've never really done in the past. But just that threat to businesses may cool the hiring of undocumented or anyone who's questionable or suspect, and even have them to fire people because they don't want that legal risk. So that's my thing. So you have things on the different ledgers. I think the growth things come later. The potential things that hurt growth come sooner, but maybe not as fast, depending on the courts, because there will be a point where the courts will get involved in immigration. But that's kind of my shtick, and I think, yes, I have 34 seconds left. If one person wants to ask one question, I could do that. Otherwise, we'll do questions later. Gracias.
Well, it's always a tough act to follow. It's a tough act to follow, my very old friend, Andy. I stress old. We've known each other for more than 20 years and worked together. And certainly Robert's presentation was outstanding in setting the tone. I want to pick up some of the themes from both of them in further trying to sort of set the table, if you will. And hopefully, Iko, tell me when I have to stop here. I don't have my watch. I think that talking about Trump, certainly from an American perspective, but Robert raised a very important point. This is the year of elections. I think, what was there, more than 75, 77 elections around the world that have been held? There's still more to come. more that have been triggered. We look at Germany, with the coming collapse of the coalition government there. Within days of President Trump being elected, there was some connection there. I'm not quite certain what, but you have that. So these are seismic times, and I think the important thing to remember about elections is when you see more than half of the population of the world voting, those are very high expectations, right? This is more than 800 million people in India voting. This is the huge number in the US. We've seen it in France, in the UK. People have expectations and hopes. And with that also comes failure to meet those expectations. And I would argue a lot of these elections we saw were not technically scheduled, many were, but they were driven by political change, social change, and immigration. Meaning, and I'll come back to Trump, and I know we'll talk about Trump certainly in the second half of this. Trump is not, from my perspective, an anomaly. I think he may be more symptomatic of our global times, of the changes that are happening. And I break it down into, from a big macro perspective, and then try and drill this down to what this means to the hemisphere, to the US, to Colombia. I think we're facing 4 major trends. Robert's touched on them, Andy touched on them. One, the rewiring of globalization. Globalization is not going away. As long as we have the internet, we're going to do trade, right? I'm reminded, and I went and looked it up the other day, it was from 1998. IBM did a fantastic ad of this very Midwestern couple. And they're somewhere in Greece, in this tiny town, and the wife's like buying the olive oil from this little old hunched over woman all in black, and she's selling it basically out of carved out rock. And it's just her little stand. And the woman's like, we're from Ohio. This is the best olive oil we've ever had. I don't know how we're ever going to be able to get something. We're just going to have to come back. And the little old lady reaches into her pocket. She goes, here's my website, right? International trade. That's never going away. It was 1998. But it is being rewired. And part of that, I would argue, is the demographic changes. And this is where we are living in historic times. United States, I'll start with my own country. If we did not have illegal immigration, and we don't really know the number, I'm just going to say 12 million, maybe 8 million, we would not only probably be moving into recession, but we would have a negative birth rate. And it would be very damaging longer term, right? This is one of the reasons, and I'll be provocative, I don't think Donald Trump's deporting anybody other than criminals, right? He's going to say, we're going to go round everybody up. No, you're not. No, you're not. Because you need these workers, and it will be inflationary. But he's going to go find every Venezuelan gang member, make a big show of it, and kick them out. But the demographics also are, I think, really creating the challenge to the geopolitics that we're facing right now. I mean, we sat at breakfast this morning, and we're all sitting there like teenagers scrolling. But we're scrolling not because we're talking to our friends, at least I wasn't, maybe Andy was, because everything's happening so fast. Everything's a crisis, right? Intercontinental ballistic missile by Russia, from Russia being fired. What has happened with this critical communications link between Finland and Germany? Who cut it? It was the Russians? I'll tell you, and again, talking to friends of mine in the US intelligence community, they're looking at a Chinese freighter having cut it on behalf of the Russians. Now, I can't prove that, but that is what Washington is most worried about right now. But let me come back to the demographics. I just mentioned the US. Let's look at China. My friend I know will be talking about the future of China here, and I'm not going to dwell on China. But you look at the demographic numbers in China and the challenge there. I was studying this the other day, and a friend made this point to me. if you look at the UN population projections, if you are a 10-year-old child in China today, you live in a country with 1.5 billion people, which has just been surpassed by India. The median projection to the UN, the US Census, etc., the median projection by 2100, when that child is 85 years old, will be something like 760 million people. Basically a halving of the population of China. Now that puts tremendous pressure on President Xi and the government. What do you do? How do you compete? This is why technology is so important. But that's a huge problem. Again, the US has this problem. We all know the challenges that the EU has with population. All have negative birth rates, with huge immigration coming in, which they're not happy about publicly, but they wouldn't have the workers without it. And the workers are coming because they know it. And by the way, back to the US, Americans complain about illegal immigration, but most of these people have family in the US. They knew where they were going. And it's because of an iPad, and it's because of a cell phone, and they knew where the jobs were, and they knew how to get there, and they all had GPS, even though they may not have had $2 in their pocket. This is the new world we live in, and these huge demographic shifts are amazing. Last two, because they're the true problem children in the world today. Russia. Look at the demographics of Russia. It is, I would argue, a dead country. It currently, officially, has 144 million people. Their own census estimates that by 2046, they'll be down to 130 million. That's smaller than Mexico. That's smaller than the Philippines. That is 9 time zones of amazing opportunity in this country. Now, I'm going to predict that number is going to be lower. This is a country that has lost 600,000 men killed in this war so far. And they're not exactly sure. The estimates are 1, 2, as high as 3 million men between the age of 18 and 40 have fled the country to avoid being conscripted. If anybody here is from Buenos Aires, maybe you can back me up on this, but I have heard there are at least 2 very beautiful Russian Orthodox churches being built in Buenos Aires by many of the folks who have left, right? So this is what we're seeing. So these are wounded bears. We're all wounded in a way, but some of these countries, and this makes for the geopolitical tensions. I'd finish this with Iran, who has caused so much trouble in the Middle East and elsewhere. This is a country of approximately 87 million people. Their own census came out earlier this year and said, if people don't start having children, which they're not doing, and they're having huge migration out, everybody's leaving, the country will be less than half its population by 2100. They'll go from 87 million to 42 million people. So we're facing governments and people who are scared. And in the midst of all of this, coming back to what I think is driving so much of this, and I think is even driving Trump, and why the US people voted back for Trump, it's what is the opportunity? They're scared of immigration. They lack skills in many ways. Look at who voted for Trump, a huge blue-collar population. I would say 60%. We'll see what the numbers come out, but my prediction is at least 60% of unions voted for Trump. Why? Because they're worried about the new technology. They're worried about how the world is changing and what is the opportunity for them going forward. I would point out we had the dock workers. Our dock workers went on strike recently in the United States. And what did they go on strike for? Yes, of course, for higher pay. But they want promises from the dock owners to not bring automation to the docks because they're redundant. How do you do that? You literally freeze time?
But these are the challenges, I think, that are happening. And this is why I think someone like Trump is not an anomaly. People are looking at their government real time, and because everybody's got a phone or an iPad, they want results. They want protection. They want hope. And if they don't get it, they'll blow the government out. The UK, perfect example. Conservatives in there for years, swept them out. Look what's happening in Germany. The coalition not working, sweep them out. Look what's happened in France, where they almost went very hard right. Then the second election, they went pretty hard left. And they've kind of a mess for now, but trying to work that out. And now we have Trump. So I think those are big themes here that we have to sort of see. And also, coming back to, and what does this mean for the region? We're building something of a new world that is a tech world dominant among free market democracies. Certainly this is something the Biden administration, the EU was working on, right? And it was, I would argue, best encapsulated in our CHIPS Act in the United States. Now, the CHIPS Act is something like I had never seen before, because as the US Congress was negotiating the CHIPS Act amongst themselves, I had never seen, maybe Andy has seen something like this, they were conferring with the European Parliament on their version of the CHIPS Act. Two separate parliaments, making sure that they weren't colliding with each other as they were preparing legislation to advance the economies of their respective peoples, right? We do not want to create legislation that is going to create trade wars. The US, turns out, did this with South Korea. They were in consultation with the Japanese. They were in consultation with India. And a portion of the CHIPS Act, believe it or not, has an element where US taxpayer money is spent helping our allies develop their own semiconductor manufacturing capability. I believe it was 2 weeks ago, could have been 3 weeks ago, the US just signed a huge deal with India, where the US government is going to help India develop their semiconductor manufacturing capability, right? Again, this sort of development of a free market coalition that mutually wants to ensure peace and prosperity. Certainly part of this in the Indo-Pacific is to counter China. We'll see where that goes with Trump. I think I have some non-consensus views there. I think there's a lot of deals that are going to be cut between Trump and China, and that you're going to see potentially a much better relationship between the US and China. But we'll see. We'll talk about that hopefully in a bit. So I think that's the other thing. But how do you do this? This is all great. We're all going to build semiconductors. We're all going to have solar panels. Well, what do you make it with? Critical minerals. And now we live in a Cold War of sorts for commodities. We're back to that, right? And all of you know that, certainly by the Chinese being throughout the hemisphere. You're looking at what Canada is beginning to do, opening up for mining. As the US begins to search for this, the EU looking at this, there are countries in the EU that are now shockingly preparing to do massive undersea mining. And I'm going to bring this back to Trump, because it's the last guy I would have thought this. But what is this whole love affair between Trump and Elon Musk? It could be just two egos that love each other. But what is Musk telling Trump? He's telling him, you want to make America great again. It's not going to be, and I was telling some folks last night this, it's not going to be bring back a hammer factory or a light bulb factory back from China. No. If you want to make America great again, you continue the CHIPS Act. You build the semiconductor facilities. You bring pharmaceutical manufacturing back. You create these high-paying jobs. This is the future. We don't need to be in trade wars with everybody. We need to negotiate with everybody. And to my point on China, Elon Musk seems to be, they've done everything but got married to each other, right? They're with each other constantly and seem to really enjoy talking. 25% of Teslas are made in China. Donald Trump's not going to get into a massive trade war knowing that, but it's going to be the deal making. And the critical minerals, I think, are going to be the critical component to this, right? So as countries race for this, I think that's going to be the next big, and it already is, the huge challenge. So we're dealing with some countries like Russia and Iran, arguably the most dangerous in the world, that are dying. Wounded bears, and how do you deal with them? Other countries going through massive transformation, China. Yes, the demographics are going down, but it's still 760 million people. China's been around for 5,000 plus years. It's not going to die and go away. But we're going to watch an amazing transformation there. And other countries trying to figure out where they fit into all of this. So I think there's so much we can talk about, certainly today. And I have to tell you, I feel sorry for you guys. Because as central bankers and asset managers, you now all have to become geopolitical experts. Because things are changing so fast, right? It is no longer, where are interest rates going? What are the money markets saying? Wait, there was a new sovereign bond listing today? How boring, right? For you, you wake up and there's intercontinental ballistic missile being fired off by Russia. What does this mean? Do we go to nuclear war? What is the safe investment? It's giving people like Andy and I and Robert a lot of business, but it's quite the challenge. So let's see what happens with Trump. But again, I think Trump is the symptom. He is not the symptom, but he's the symbol, that's the word, of what we're really seeing around the world. And I think what you're going to see with Trump in the next year and a half is going to make you dizzy. And I'll leave it with this, so we have plenty of time, extra time actually. I think anybody who's saying this is Trump 2.0 is missing it. Think of this as Trump 4.0 or 5.0. This is a guy who failed effectively in his first term. He'll never admit that, but now has spent the last 4 years not running his business. He's been doing two things. Learning how government works, because he really didn't understand that when he was elected in 2016. And also sitting in courtrooms. And if I was sitting in a courtroom as much as he was, I think I'd be thinking other things like, how does government work, right? He's got the legal problems behind him. He has figured out and understands what works and doesn't work in government, what these agencies and departments do. I say this with great respect to the president-elect. I would bet, and I told a couple of people last night, in 2016 when he was elected, if you asked him, what does the Department of Energy do? He would say something like, they're in charge of energy. Do you know anything more? No. I think he was probably as shocked as any of us in 2016. He's not shocked now. And he's ready. And he wants to really make a historic impact, long term. And here's why it's going to be dizzying. Not only has he spent 4 years learning and creating around him a trusted group of people, like Elon Musk, David Sachs, the big billionaire tech executive, other people, right? He has what he needs there. But he also understands, this is the unusual aspect of his presidency, he's a lame duck. He cannot run again. And he understands and he's telling his people this. We don't have 4 years, we have 2 years. Regardless if we lose control, Republicans lose control of the House or the Senate, we have 2 years. We have to get everything done now. So every day we're going to be waking up and looking at our Twitter account and our news accounts and something different, because he's going to try and move to make the U.S., as he says, great again, but back to all of these other issues. I think he actually grasps quite deeply the competition, the future, technology, critical minerals, and it's all going to be about deal making. Hello, Colombia. We don't like what you do with this, selling to us on whatever. But you have these critical minerals. Let's cut a deal, or I'll put tariffs on you. Hello, Indonesia. One by one by one. We may be entering into an age of new bilateral and bilateral trade relations like we have never seen before. So let's see how that goes, and I look forward to talking with my colleagues, and I will hand back the extra time.
Thank you. great to be speaking after Frank because he left us with one positive, out of consensus comment, which unfortunately I agree, that Trump may not be that disruptive in a bad way. So we'll see about that. My job here today is also to talk about Trump, unfortunately, but also in relation to China. So I've got two issues here to discuss. One is the potential tariffs, impact on China, on the world, on the region. There's more macroeconomics. Positive disruption, I would argue. You'll see from my evidence later on. And then the second thing, which I like to spend a bit more time on, is the geopolitical risk that is keeping everybody up at night. So hopefully my comment later on will help you sleep better. If not, then you just keep losing your sleep, unfortunately. Let's go to the tariff thing. But these are the two stress points that I talk about. China, US over Taiwan, and then the tariffs. So let's get to the tariffs first. Details are still pending. But there are some broad conjecture that we can make using whatever available evidence is there and data. One big question that people often ask is, how would China fight back? Well, I say in terms of the tariffs, China can't fight back. Tit for tat, at least. Because simply, the Chinese import much less from the US than the US import more from China. So I think it's very clear that in the tariff war in the short term, who wins? Not China. But China is preparing, or has already prepared, for such a long-term trade conflict with the US. China didn't start yesterday, didn't start before the election. It started, from my memory, at least 2020, if not earlier than that. So in 2020, China announced this so-called dual circulation strategy, if you remember or know what it is. The core of that strategy is to defend China from the external forces, and part of that is from the trade conflict with the US. So that's why, over the past years, China has been building or developing new export markets from with other countries, and as you can see in the chart on the left there, that I'm comparing China's exports to the BRI countries, the Belt and Road Initiative countries, between 2020 and 2023, to see how the exports grow, and you can see this phenomenal growth in those 3 years of Chinese growth to the BRI countries. But when you look at China's exports to the US and Europe, it's about the same. So that's very obvious that China is developing new export markets as a part of the fight against the US tariff or whatever restrictions. The right-hand side chart tells the same thing, but it's more on Asia. That China's exports to Asia has been growing phenomenally in recent years, and the chart below reflects another effort that China is fighting the trade war with the US in the medium-long term, and that is the Chinese have been increasing FDIs to Asia, especially ASEAN. The point of doing that is very simple. Chinese factories, Chinese companies down in Asia will continue to source inputs from China, produce in Asia, export directly from Asia. One way to get around the the Trump policy on trade against China, we'll see how successful that is, but so far it has been successful. I mean, Mexico down here in the region is a prime example of the benefits of trade aversion from the trade conflict between China and the US. And we all know that Chinese have been increasing investment, exports to Mexico, and from Mexico it sells to the US, to Europe, and so on. So that's the trade side. That's medium, long term. I think China does have a game plan, and it seems that it's working out fine for China. More problematic is the export restrictions on tech goods, technology transfer to China. So again, the American policy on that is focusing on the high end of the chip sector in China. And China, in the short, medium term, cannot fight back. Companies that produces semiconductors in the high-end area is going to be hurt. We saw the pains from Huawei, ZTE, and so on. but not for the downstream, lower value-added chips, because China runs a big trade surplus with the world in selling chips to the world, more than it imports. So again, short term, there's nothing China can do. But again, the Chinese is always, long term. Probably because we have a government that doesn't go through all these elections, right? President Xi Jinping is now president forever. So they can afford to have this long-term vision, long-term policy strategy to think about, to put in place. So when you look at the top chart there, simply look at the data. China's spending on R&D as a percentage of GDP is catching up to the US level in recent years. And the lower chart shows specifically there's a fund called a big fund. I'm not sure you heard about it. Big fund, and the official name is the China Circuit Industry Investment Fund or something like that. So it started off in 2014 and it was less than 20 billion. Today, it's almost 100 billion. And that fund focuses only or mainly on production of chips, manufacturing, R&D, innovation, and so on. And that's why we've seen some success of the Chinese story of their own initiative to grow the tech sector, to try to be self-sufficient. I summarized those 3 key stories that are reported by the media showing Chinese progress. Huawei, SMIC, and so on. They've been developing nano chips, 7 nanometer chips, 5 nanometer chips, progressing quite quickly within a year or two. That's been widely used. Now that surprised the world. Not that the chips are very sophisticated. It's still less sophisticated than the 3 nanometer chips that America, Europe are using. But it's the progress in the face of all these trade restriction obstacles that China is facing. So the point on the trade conflict, from tariffs to export restrictions, short term, China gets hurt. Medium, long term, I would give China the benefit of the doubt that it will be able to work out something to protect itself. So let's see how that goes. From a trade global perspective, I have this view that deglobalization is unfolding. But that's bad. But then there's regionalization that China is pushing. And the way I see it is China's regionalization process or policy direction is coming up to offset or counteract the negative drag from deglobalization. So there's something to watch out for. For those of you thinking about investment themes and ideas, if you're focused on hedging against deglobalization, you should probably think about going to look at regionalization-related themes. Second point, which could now become a big risk for the world if it unfolds as some of the American analysts or politicians point out, and that is obviously China-US relations or tensions over Taiwan. Here, I tend to use a game theory approach to look at the issue and try to figure out the strategies, what are the best strategies for both countries, and how likely that China-US war over Taiwan will erupt. It is a very academic approach, but it's widely applied, and it has practical applications in economics, in finance, in social work, and especially in the military. So this framework helps us to think through all the events or the moves rationally, logically, and also practically. So let's start with this. China-US, salient point, Taiwan. So the common understanding of the risks is that China attacks Taiwan, drags in US, NATO, and so on, and then we all end up, boom, World War III, nuclear war, and don't think about investment, because no one will live. So there are strategies between the two countries on this issue. Cooperate. Two countries, no war, work together, happy ending. So I call it a C, cooperative strategy. And then there's a war strategy, that they fight over Taiwan, and so on. So it's the W, a war strategy. So the combination of those strategies, I summarize it in this matrix there with different colors just to make it easier to identify. So the first strategy that we looked at is, cooperation on two sides. Then I assign numeric numbers to these strategies as outcome, as payoffs. Now, the absolute number doesn't really tell anything, but it's the relative numbers that tells, if you've got a higher number positive, that means there's positive impact on those strategies. If there's a negative number, there's a negative impact of those strategies. So when you look at the strategy number one, the yellow box, two countries, they don't go to war, they cooperate, so that means they can focus on whatever economic development policy, macro policy, to pursue potential growth. So it's a win-win situation. So I give it a 10 as a payoff. Is it likely? It is not likely, because China definitely wants Taiwan back. Whatever name you call it, incorporation, reincorporation, reunification or something. Right? China definitely wants Taiwan back, either with force or without force. On the American side, they think that China will fight and get Taiwan back by force. So I think this thinking are not going to change anytime soon. So there's not going to be cooperation on both sides. Low odds outcome, good payoffs, not very likely. The second strategy, the red box, worst case scenario. Both sides fight, there's going to be war, and the potential war coming out of that is likely to be, each country throwing nuclear weapons against each other, then there will be World War III, and then, there will be a big threat to even the human race. So that is a very dramatic, disastrous outcome. So I give it a negative 100 payoff, very bad. So possibility of that happening, is it high? I think it's not high, assuming rational minds still run policies. Militarily, there's something called MAD, mutually assured destruction. It's when countries throw nuclear weapons against each other, then you are assured that everybody will die. So that creates this, the military analysts called mutual deterrence. That you just won't go that extreme, because no country can afford to see the damages out of that. So it's a low odds outcome. And also when you think about the war between China and US over Taiwan, on the Chinese side there's one misconception or one less understood factor that outside China, outside Asia, that most other countries do not know. And that is the Chinese army cannot attack Taiwan on discretion, as commonly assumed. Because there's a 2025 anti-secession law in China that states out 3 very clear conditions under which the Chinese army can move in against Taiwan. One is Taiwan declares independence outright. Second is something happens in the world, something happens outside Taiwan that prompts Taiwan to declare independence. And number 3, after a very long period of time of trying peaceful unification, reincorporation, whatever, China still cannot take back Taiwan, then the army can move in. When you look through what's happening, the situation between Taiwan and China, whatever tensions, it's been around for 75 years. It's going to carry on. So none of the 3 conditions has been fulfilled to allow the Chinese army legally to attack Taiwan. So unless there's some very powerful generals who could do things outside of President Xi Jinping's control, the army cannot move. On the US, does the US really want war with China over Taiwan? When you look at the statements and all these reports, sounds like yes. But I think likely not, because when you look at the US foreign policy on China, it's still strategic ambiguity that runs the whole policy, which shows in the fact that on one hand the US has kept warning Taiwan, don't go independence, don't declare independence, don't irritate China. On the other hand, it keeps warning China, you don't go attack Taiwan. Because if you go attack Taiwan, I will come to Taiwan's rescue because of the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act that will have to bring in the US if Taiwan is being attacked. So if the US is in, then NATO is in, then you are talking about nuclear warheads flying all above our heads. So the war situation, not really likely, assuming rational mind still rules. So China, that goes the blue box. China attacks Taiwan, war. America doesn't move militarily. So flowing in the complication in the thinking here, that the U.S. reaction. As I mentioned, there's a 1979 Taiwan Relations Act that will require the U.S. to come to Taiwan's rescue if China attacks Taiwan. So most people just tend to think that the Americans will bring in warships and planes and bombs. That's not the only options that the Americans have. Sanctions is another big, powerful tool. You look at what the US does on Russia, China is scared about that too. So if the Americans do not react militarily, but react financially, economically, trade, whatever other means, I call it a cooperation from the US side, but a war situation from the Chinese side. So that's the strategy number three. That is strategy number 3. So in that case, that is basically the tension situation that we've been seeing between China and US over Taiwan over the past 20, 30 years. Nothing is going to change. It's going to continue. There will be more tensions between US, more tensions between US and China over Taiwan, more war of words, more trade policy, and so on and so forth, but life goes on. We'll still continue to see the conventional policies that the two countries will pursue. So they will still be able to grow, but then because of the financial economic conflicts, both countries will lose. So I'll give it a -5 payoff. It's not too bad, but then it's not good. The last strategy, number 4, is China cooperates. China doesn't move anything. The US attacks, goes into war. Now this, again, is a complication in thinking. By W, war initiated by the US over the Taiwan issue, I don't mean the US sends warships and take over Taiwan and fight against China. What I mean is, from the Chinese perspective, when the US keeps funding Taiwan's military, selling planes, bombs, and also sending very senior officials like Nancy Pelosi in 2022 to visit Taiwan, that's seen by the Chinese as like invasion into China's domestic affairs. The Chinese keep saying that. So that's war effort from the Chinese perspective by the Americans. Now I think Americans will keep doing that. So this is that definition of W on the US side that I have in this strategy. That the US keeps the support for Taiwan that China doesn't like, but China doesn't really move against it. It just keep, all these war words and economic conflicts and so on. So that means tensions, situations carry on. Nothing really changed much going forward. We will live with this situation today, and we will continue to live with the situation 5 years down the road, 7 years down the road, whatever. All right, so that is basically status quo. So that gives an outcome, I give it a 0 and a 0. So when you weight all these strategies against each other, it's obviously, when you look at the payoffs, number 1 is the best. But it's not likely to happen. So the next best, the practical outcome, strategies by the two sides, US, China, is what we call national equilibrium in economics game theory, is strategy number 4. Tensions remain, but no military conflict. National equilibrium, in case you forget what it is just like, two players, they've chosen their strategy and there's no incentive to change strategy after knowing the other side's best strategy. So that's an equilibrium, but that is an unstable equilibrium. Accidents can happen. So when we put all this together, what I'm seeing going forward is status quo. tensions and so on, but no war. No major large-scale war in Asia. And one last word on China's option. China doesn't have to attack Taiwan if it wants to get Taiwan back and give Taiwan a hard time and make them kneel. Right? Blockade is an option which China has been using. Nancy Pelosi visited China 2022. That's what happened. The black patches were the areas that China had very serious military drills all around Taiwan. And during those 3-4 months that China did that blockade, Taiwan was basically shut off. From an investment perspective, you are buying Taiwan assets, the risk premium on Taiwan assets will have to go up. And China can do it again, and it has done it recently again. If you check the news, last month for 3 weeks, China did exactly the same with the 5 big areas of military drills on Taiwan. Americans didn't say anything much about it. So you see that tension between the two remains, but then the mutual deterrence is in effect putting the two countries on tensions, but no crazy moves. And then China can also take over some outlying islands of Taiwan that Taiwan claims ownership. So examples I have here is Kinmen, Penghu, and Matsu Islands. So those, I don't think the Americans will wage a war against China if China takes those little islands. So that concludes my thoughts on the China-US tensions issue, which could possibly end up a big geopolitical risk if war really breaks out. But at this point, I still put it a very low odds outcome that there are other things that we have to worry about. Last word, what I said just now could be all wrong, so please read this very carefully. And if there's any questions, I think we can either do it here or we can do it in the panel later on. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Hello. Okay, so one administrative announcement. This is probably one of the most important people for you. This is Jorge. He's in charge of logistics. So anything you may have with hotel, transportation, Cartagena in general, or your reservations and what have you, he's the person. So Jorge. All right. Let's see. Also, some people told us that they missed the Wi-Fi connection information, so we are going to be projecting that if you want to go ahead with that. We'll leave it now over the break. And we will be reconvening at 11, so you're going to have plenty of time to ask all these rock stars on their thoughts. So thank you so much, and we'll see you in 30 minutes.
¿Quién me está llamando? Ahora sí, dale. Hola, hola, hola. Hola, hola, sí. Hola, hola. Sí, hola, hola, sí. ¿Lo subiste más ganancia? No, está bien así. Hola, hola. Quita la música. Sí, ok. E. Baja el volumen. Sí, hola, hola. Sí, ok. Hola, hola, sí. Byron. Como por 4.000, bájale, un poquito. Sí, hola, hola. Sí, ok. Sí, hola, hola. Ponle un poquito de bajo, un minutita de bajo. Sí, ok, hola, hola. No, mucho. Sí, hola, hola. Copia y pega.
Eso es. Mira, ya te está recogiendo más. E, 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 E. Ey, ey. Ey, 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 ey. Hola, hola, hola. Dos, dos. Hola, hola, hola. Coge. Creo que por ahí está mejor.
Espérate, no, no, mútalo. Hola. Bájale un poquito el volumen. Sí, hola, hola. Sí, ok, hola, hola. Sí, hola, hola. Hola, hola, sí. Hola, hola. Sí, ok, hola, hola. Sube un poquito el volumen. Sí, hola, hola. ¿Ya? Perfecto. Pon la música.
Un, dos, prueba. Yo creo que bien. ¿Qué pasó aquella?
Hello. Hello. Hello, hello. Thank you very much. We are going to start in a minute with our panel. Please, if you could take your seats.
Hola, 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 hola. Hello, hello.
Thank you.
Okay, be seated. We are about to begin. Robert, the honor is yours.
Welcome back, everyone. Did everyone had their cafecito? You feel good? Wonderful. So we have all the energy we need to launch into this amazing panel. You all know my colleagues here. We do have one surprise addition, someone that we haven't seen in quite some time, Iker. And so this part of the session is intended to be as interactive as it can be. We're going to keep track of who asks questions, and there might be prizes afterwards, okay? So please ask those questions, raise those arms, do what's necessary so I can see you out there, and we can direct those questions to those that you would like to get responses from, okay? So, to kick off, we've had an amazing morning, a lot of different talking points, a lot of key takeaways, a lot of breaking news overnight. So I thought maybe just to kind of get our juices flowing in terms of what we'd like to address, maybe I would direct the first question to my colleague, Andy. And Andy, Frank said something interesting. He said, Trump 2.0, forget about that. It's possible we might see a Trump 4.0, even maybe a 5.0, because there's this realization inside the president-elect's administration and campaign that they only have 2 years to get stuff done. So, on that note, if Trump's plans to advance whatever agenda he has over the next 2 years falters, how do Democrats rally back?
Yeah. Great question. So the simple answer is the Democrats have nothing. I'll repeat that. The Democrats have nothing, and they won't have anything. They are the opposition party, and it's only through Trump's failure that they will have something. So they're going to do this whole after-action review, assessment of what went wrong, but it's really not about them. It's really about Donald Trump and the extent to which he can deliver for the group of people who voted for him.
Okay.
And if he delivers for them, he is setting up himself and the Republican Party for victory in 2028. Mm-hmm. However, given the ambition of his agenda and the potential impact if he's able to actually achieve his agenda, and I'll just say it this way. There's certain things that Republicans have wanted to achieve over time, and when they've been successful, and there's a phrase, I'm not sure if it's international, it's like the dog catching the car that they've been chasing for some time, and they've been, what do you do when you get there? And they did that on abortion rights, and they caught the car, and the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and then it became, wait, what do I do? And it turned back on them. I think if they do go full bore and do massive deportation and do 60% tariffs, it'll backfire. And that's why I think Frank is right, that ultimately they're going to directionally move that way and at least have symbolic victory that they can claim. But the more and more they go, it's just going to land right back in the Democrats' hands to say, look, you guys, this is what you voted for. Yes, he's delivered, but this is not what you want, and there'll be a rejection of that as he moves along that spectrum. Where that sweet spot is, we don't know. But I'm sure his political officials are talking to him about that. We just don't know where his proclivity is and how far he wants to push it.
Well, I have you. Any one or two names that have popped up for Democratic nominees in 2028?
The governors. So Newsom in California.
Perfect.
Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, and Shapiro in Pennsylvania. But there'll be tons of others who are vying for that.
Great. Frank, please. On that note, one of the big decisions that Trump has to make is the Fed chair. And Jerome Powell's term, I believe, ends in 2026. Now, for all those of you here, it was Trump who nominated Jerome Powell in the first place. So the question is, what might happen? Obviously, Jerome Powell himself has said publicly that if he's asked to step down, he would not. But anyway, 2026, what do you foresee, Frank, given what you hear out there?
Well, first, I think it was very important that Powell said what he said. I think he said it not because he actually feels threatened by Trump, but it was putting down the marker of the independence of the Fed, which is critical. But we all knew it was going to stay independent, and I think we all believe that Trump was bluster and threatening, never acknowledging that he actually had put Powell up in the first place. That's long forgotten. But there was enough concern in the market, and you all hear it probably more than anybody else, that Trump was going to force Powell out. This was going to be, the Federal Reserve would be subject to the president, so Powell did what he did. Look, I think the interesting thing about Powell that a lot of folks in the market have missed is that Powell knows this is his end. He knew a year ago, at least, he wasn't going to be reappointed in 2026. And I don't think he wants to be reappointed, right? So it was at least 8-10 months ago that Donald Trump said, I will, of course, will not reappoint him. And he put out 3 candidates right off the bat, and one was Art Laffer, the economist of the Laffer curve, Kevin Hassett, who I know well, and I know Andy knows Kevin from Washington. He's a very accomplished economist, a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And the last one is Kevin Warsh, a former economic aide to George W. Bush, who then became the youngest Federal Reserve governor in Fed history, who's now at Stanford University, and you see his name is being floated around as a potential Treasury Secretary. I don't think that's going to happen. So there's his 3 names. What was interesting from the other side of this was, I don't think if Biden had stayed in the race and won, he would have reappointed him, because he wanted to have his own person there. Any president's going to want to do that. And with Vice President Harris, when she became the nominee, that immediately sealed the deal, that if she were to win, because most people don't realize when she was a U.S. Senator, she led a very vocal fight to try and block Powell from being confirmed the first time he was nominated by Donald Trump. So Fed independence, I think, had been locked in for quite a while. And I love to tell the story because Jay is related to a friend of mine, and she sees him at Christmas parties all the time. And I tell this story all the time, but it's worth repeating because I think this is true for the Fed. Concern about Fed independence. She saw him at a Christmas party, and she's like, Jay, how are you? And he said, Jay, what's the matter? He does this little pantomime. I had to take off my invisible earmuffs. Ben Bernanke gave them to me, and I wear them everywhere in Washington. And I think that shows, again, Jay Powell is going to do what Jay Powell needs to do, which I think is probably the best outcome for the U.S. economy and the global economy.
Great. So we had 2 questions out there. Has this sparked any curiosity, any additional curiosity on the U.S. outlook from the audience? Any questions so far? Okay, we've got our markers out there. Look at those
Yeah,
prizes are waiting.
I don't think
Do we have one out there?
Carlos?
Please.
Yeah, I have probably two questions, and well, probably three questions, because I'm shy. The first question is related to the fiscal front with this in the U.S., because, I mean, probably the expectation is that with the politics and probably with the control of the Congress, you will have a significant fiscal push, but in the future, that's going to mean significant challenges for the U.S. fiscal policy. So probably if you can comment on that. The second is more related to the way that wars are held nowadays. And I mean, we have the issue this morning about the missile, but I guess in the future it's going to be more in terms of cyber attacks and the like. And how do you see that going forward? And the third question is related to sanctions, because that has been used, especially by Trump, significantly in the past. And you have an ongoing situation with Russia and other countries, and it's becoming probably a weaponization of the dollar. So if you also can comment on that as well.
Great, thank you. So just to put a little bit of context before we hand it over. So bear in mind that maybe a month ago, we were looking at potentially 6 rate cuts by the Fed through the end of 2025. That number has now been reduced to around 3 to 4 rate cuts. And the reason why, simply, is because now we have the advent of a new Trump administration and the prospect of tariffs, the impact or the inflationary impact of lower immigration, all that's starting to feed into the other narrative, which is about, to your point, where the fiscal deficit is today in the U.S., the high U.S. debt load. We are also late cycle in the U.S. relative to where Trump was in 2016. So all these forces are weighing on assumptions by the Congressional Budget Authority, right? Saying, okay, if rates stay at these higher for longer levels, how does that aggravate the interest expense portion of the deficit, right? That's what people are looking at. So given where we are today, and if you extrapolate that, obviously that weighs on prospects for bond market returns. So I want to put that layering on because I think, first of all, it's important. Second, given where we are today with policy and talking about tariffs, talking about immigration, maybe Frank, just kind of sticking with you for a moment, like this whole discussion inside about the fiscal picture. How is the president-elect, how is the administration thinking about addressing this 64,000-pound monster that's in the room?
One interesting thing I want to say about rate cuts. I have a theory that the Federal Reserve is struggling with having correct data. And both the Wall Street Journal wrote about this less than a year ago, Barron's Magazine has written about this, that a wide swath of economic data that is collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Department of Commerce, the response rate has plummeted massively by sometimes 40, 50% over the last 4 years. And I believe this is why Powell keeps saying this one particular phrase. It depends on the totality of the data. So I think there's something there to that they're struggling to see. And I think because of the illegal immigration issue, that is one of the key factors. Companies aren't telling the government how many employees are they going to hire, because they don't want to say, I just hired 30 illegal immigrants and they're great workers, right? Because they don't want to get raided or in trouble. So I think there's a struggle here with data, which is very interesting.
Yep.
The tariffs issue, and let me just, to the budget issue, I would watch for very quickly, and I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we see, even before Trump is, the key dates to know, US Congress gets sworn in January 3rd, Trump gets sworn in January 20th. My prediction is, even before they're sworn in, Trump says 2 things. I want everybody confirmed, my entire cabinet and most of the sub-cabinet confirmed immediately between the 3rd and the 20th. And I would also watch for something we've never seen before, the emergence of a tax bill and budget bill using this weird thing they call reconciliation in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So we're not even into the new Congress. So here it is, work it all out now. You Republican leaders, figure it all out now, because when you get into office on the 3rd, you can start moving on passing on this. So come January 20th, I get sworn in, and what's the first thing I'm doing? I'm signing the new tax bill, and I'm signing this new budget bill, which I have very serious fears is going to be draconian in its cuts to try and bring the deficit down, right? And that we'll be trying to clean that up for a number of years. On the tariff side, it's going to be interesting to see. We should talk about that probably separately. And sanctions, can I touch on that quickly?
Yeah.
This is a growing worry in the US Congress because they're beginning to understand the impact of the BRICS. The BRICS constantly talking about wanting to create another currency that's failed over and over. At some point, maybe it won't. And if it does create another currency, then it's going to make tariffs and sanctions that the US impose much, much weaker.
Yep. Andy, a brief bolt-on to
Yeah,
what
so
Frank said?
specifically to the deficit discussion, and this has always been an interest of mine since I was in the Clinton White House when we negotiated the 1997 bipartisan budget agreement, balanced budget, which led to 4 years of surplus. I think my nirvana situation for budget reduction was a split government. So we don't have split government.
Right.
And while I do think Frank is right with respect to some draconian cuts, most of those cuts, I believe, are going to be within the discretionary annual appropriations process, which is the smallest part of the budget. So it's defense plus non-defense. The big boat is entitlements. It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the other big boat is revenue. Now, they'll get some revenue off tariffs, and they'll probably take claim for that. But I don't see them touching Social Security and Medicare. Now, if they do, that's game-changing, right? And that'd be a very high political risk. The problem with that is every time you try to touch Social Security, Medicare, I mean, the way you do it is you say the new generation, sorry, you didn't vote. You don't get the same level the previous people have, the people currently retired. But what happens is the minute you have any cuts, they just say they're cutting Social Security, and then everyone who has it fears it's going away. So I think on the discretionary side they will have it, but I don't think there's going to be major actually impactful. I think it may be redirecting, and I think there needs to be something because the service on the debt with the higher interest rates right now, service on the debt is going to exceed the defense budget very shortly. So I don't have as much optimism on that. I think symbolically, yes, but not actual meaningful deficit reduction.
On this topic of fiscal, let's flip to the other side of the story. Chi.
Can I interject?
Absolutely.
Can I interject a bit? And I want to add something on the sanction issue to share the feeling and views from Asia, for those people, companies, and official institutions that I talk to. Now, there's a big negative feeling on the U.S. sanction policy, of course. And that feeling actually has degenerated into fear. Obviously, that the country thinks that for fear that if the Americans don't like them and stand on the wrong side, we get sanctions as bad as Russia got from the US. So that fear is also shared by China as well. That fits into one of the incentives of the regional monetary authorities to diversify out of dollar risk. And that's why when you look at gold accumulation by central banks in Asia, China is leading the way. That over the past 5, 6, 7 years, the accumulation of gold in official reserves has gone up significantly. My mic is not working?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's echo. Maybe that's a signal that I shouldn't talk about this. But I guess this is comes back again. Anyway, my point there is
that the sanction policy has sunk into the Asian thinking. I speak for Asia because I deal with them more. Has sunk into the Asian thinking that this is going to be a long-term policy by the US. And that fits into a fear that in turn prompts the Asian companies, central banks, official institutions to diversify out of the US market. So gold is one of the beneficiaries of that move. Treasury on the long term is going to be, the holding of treasury by Asian or other investments is going to fall. Look at the data. It's been falling already, but it's not really falling so quickly that you'll see in a week or 2 weeks data. If you look through the last 5 to 7 years, definitely China and Singapore, their holding of treasuries have been falling. So I think that is something about the sanction policy that the U.S. has been implementing with impact on Asia, on the regional thinking and their reaction to such a policy.
Gee, let me bring you now to markets one more time. So the gentleman had asked about fiscal, and obviously, we've summed it up quite nicely here that we're hoping, or the expectation is that the U.S. will do something on the fiscal side. Same thing for China, except the reverse. We're waiting some kind of stimulus boost. So please, can you give us a little color on what your expectations are on that front? And, if you don't mind, because we've also discussed the prospect of tariffs, and we kind of touched on the fact that perhaps that might, force the Chinese authorities to take steps to weaken the exchange rate, what might that mean for the region? And obviously, in an environment of higher U.S. rates, maybe a stronger dollar, how does that hurt Xi Jinping's, outlook of seeing China as a global trade partner, given where we are today? Please, any color on that front?
I will go to the second question first, the exchange rate. In the context of tariffs, the expectation is that probably in the second half of next year, the U.S. tariffs on China, probably on other parts of the world, will come. It takes a few months for legislation to go through and so on. So from that perspective,
Okay, cannot hear you, Chief.
Yeah, they can't. Yeah, you got it.
The voice is not going through. Oh, sorry about that. Oh, you need the translation. Forgot about that. In terms of the foreign exchange reaction, obviously tariffs from the US on China, on other parts of the world, will generate a devaluation incentive for other countries. For the simple fact that devaluing your currency is the easiest way to offset some of the tariff impacts. When you looked at what China did, what the renminbi exchange rate behaved in the last round, the first round of tariff war, between 2018 and 2019, the RMB against the dollar depreciated by 14% in the 2 years, so 7% each year. So I think it's natural to expect that Chinese currency will depreciate this time when tariffs come. But also there's an impact, similar impact on the regional currencies in Asia as well. That, especially Asia, because Asia basically, we are all open, small, exporting economies. So the central banks do have incentive to devalue the currency to help offset the tariff impact. There's also an interaction between the weakness of the RMB and the weakness of the other Asian currencies. I looked at the correlation between the movement of the Asian major currencies and the RMB movement over the past 10 years or so. The correlation between the Asian currencies and the RMB movement positive and had increased as compared to more than 10 years ago. And more interestingly is that comparison also did it with the US dollar and euro. The Asian currencies correlation of the movement with the dollar and the euro actually dropped over the past 10 years as compared to the 10 years before that, or many years before that. So that, to me, it seems that there is an RMB block to be built in Asia over the past decade or so, which I think is a natural development because Asia has been trading more with China. You look at the trade data. Intra-regional trade with China has been rising persistently. So obviously, if you have your biggest trading partner is China, you want to have a stable exchange rate against your biggest trading partner so that you can plan your trade and whatnot.
Right.
So to summarize on that, impact tariffs on Asia, on China's currencies, we do expect depreciation. There's some market estimates that the RMB could depreciate by about 10%, 12% against the dollar within the first year of the tariffs implementation. And then the first part of the question, the stimulus.
Yes.
Fiscal spending is the billion-dollar question that everybody is trying to figure out. The market has been disappointed for
at least 2 years, because there's been many false starts that the Chinese government said will increase spending, pump up growth, which in turn will help improve earnings growth, and then the stock market should go up. So every time when there was such an announcement and some easing, the Chinese market went up. And then it came back down because there was no follow-up. So the Chinese did that for more than 2 years, and in their jargon, that is incremental easing that the Chinese authorities were using. And they do have a good reason for that. From my understanding, Beijing's primary goals in managing the economy are to continue with structural reforms, which are deflationary, hurts earnings growth, and also deleveraging, which again is deflationary. But their assumption until recently was that the economy would be resilient enough to just live with some stimulus so that the structural reforms, the deleveraging efforts could still go through. So that's what the authorities in China had been thinking until, I would say, September this year, when they announced this much bigger stimulus package, which hopefully this time will change their thinking in terms of easing and will bring forward a continuous a series of easing measures to help keep growth momentum from faltering further. So the question is, what made them change their mind in September, making that big bigger stimulus package? When you look at the data, the writing is on the wall. Stock market fell for 2 years until recently. Bond yields in China fell for 2 years to record lows, which makes the central bank in China worried about a bubble being built in the bond market. So I think that's not really an issue to me, because it shows that there's no confidence in the economy, and that's why people flock into Chinese government bonds and policy bonds. And then when you look at the number of loss-making Chinese companies over the past 2 years, kept going up. Private investment growth, 0 for more than 3 years, on average. Consumption growth in China, we saw that's not enough. Putting all this together, I think it has now hit the political nerves of the Chinese authorities, that if they don't do anything more aggressively, their power base would be challenged. We've seen and heard, even in the Chinese system, there were, especially during COVID, protests, demonstrations, here and there. So that's, I think, China has come to the point that the political nerves have been hit, and the authorities think that they have to do something more serious. Now, what are the signs? When you look at the announcement of the September package, there were a few signs that show that, in my view, they were panicking, the authorities in China, panicking, so that they need to do something more. One is that it's the first time in China's modern economic history that the 3 super regulators joined together and make the announcement for the easing package. The PBOC, the CSRC, and the newly created, I think it was a few years ago by President Xi Jinping, the National Structural Reform Committee or something. So they make that announcement. And then also, it's the first time that the PBOC did 3 things in one go: cutting interest rates, cutting the bank reserve requirement ratio, injecting capital into banks. So when you put all this together, I just can't help but think that the Chinese authorities are panicking, which is good news for us. Because we want them to panic so that they would increase their stimulus package, and then the market wants to hear them. And that's why Chinese stocks reacted so positively for a few weeks, until recently that it's gone sideways, because the market is now waiting for further announcement of further stimulus package. But at this point, I think I am giving China more benefit of the doubt that they will do more aggressive easings and continue to do it for at least another quarter or two.
And you have a furrowed brow.
Well, no, he piqued my curiosity, and maybe either our host or you, when you said that there's this correlation between the currencies of China and the rest of Asia, I was wondering, based on your chart on the trade and the investment in South America and how that's changed from being US-centric to China-centric.
Right.
You probably don't have the data in front of you. What do you think that same correlation might be developing between moving from correlating to the dollar and the South American countries to moving more towards being more correlated with China because of the influence of China in the region? I don't know.
I mean, Chi, you're definitely the master of all this. I think just at a very surface level, I would say that that chart was trying to highlight almost the, I don't want to say necessarily indifference. I'm not sure if it's necessarily correct to say it was calculated, but certainly there's some neglect from a U.S. foreign policy standpoint toward Latin America. And in that void of 23 years, that was the time period in the chart, the Chinese have been able to extend their Belt and Road Initiative across Asia, Africa, and has made tremendous inroads into Latin America for no surprise reasons, which is that when you think about lithium, nickel, and other rare minerals, you think about just energy commodities in general. If you're China, why would you not go to where the action is? Why would you not be taking advantage of those markets if one of your biggest rivals out there is not paying attention? So I'm not sure about the correlations, but I think from an ideological, philosophical standpoint, the U.S. has made a very big mistake. And in the context of what I spoke about earlier, that we need to think about renewable energy sources. We need to think about this, the finite supply of current energy resources to have left Latin America, I don't know if the right word is alone. Honestly, part of my mind is saying you almost like abandoned it. It's a very grave mistake when you're thinking about trying to pursue this whole semiconductor chip effort using the CHIPS Act and so forth. Something is not right, which is why the title of that chart was, I don't think the right hand is necessarily knowing what the left hand is doing. But please, if I may pivot, just, we can come back to this. The third part of the question that was asked was about war, and I think that there's only one mind here, I think, that can really go there, and that's Eker. So Eker, I know there's a strange connection with this whole war thing and what I'm about to ask, but if we consider that chart showing the market cap of tech companies relative to the GDP of key countries out there, first of all, that's an incredible comparison. Frank said something very interesting to the asset managers and the reserve managers out here. He said, yeah, you could pay attention to money markets and rates and all that. That's nice. But if you're not paying attention to geopolitics, you're going to miss something pretty big. And so on that note, when we combine how tech companies are starting to influence policy in countries, and we think about the geopolitical environment, from your standpoint, having written 3 excellent pieces on this concept of AI, tech companies, their role almost as the new feudal lords in our world order, please, any color you can give us on this question regarding how wars are being fought today, please.
Thank you, Frank, and all gentlemen, making hard to follow you after those presentations. So let me maybe frame this a bit. So I am working on some investment thesis along those lines, but let me reflect a bit on your presentations in the first part of the morning, what I saw and what I did not see, and given, comparing this event with previous editions. So 2 of you are investment strategies, and then Frank and Andy are more political experts and so on. But I was surprised pleasantly about the emphasis that you guys were placing in the technology element, on the AI, on all the implications, and then how that also relates to the trade wars and the placing in power. She explored how China is saying, well, I mean, you're going to sanction me here. I don't mind. I'm going to invest heavily in tech and be able to build those chips. So that's one portion. And then on the other, it was not like, I mean, there were no mentions to the Fed and all this process, and then prospects for growth and exports, and it was or more like like on a tangent. So I do think that's a sign of the times. And then that chart that you presented, putting in the same lines all these Max 7, Tesla, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and the like, on the side of Germany, UK, France, Japan, and so on. It's like, I mean, and you did mention that in the past 5 years, if you blink, you missed a lot. So just putting these companies alongside the most developed countries in the world, that's like eye-opening. A couple other points of reference to that. If you add the Max 7, they are pretty much the size of the GDP of China. So that's, I mean, China is about 17.7 or so, and the Max 7 as of last were about 16 trillion. So granted, GDP and valuation are different metrics, but in terms of size and influence, and putting them in the same point in the conversation is quite significant. And then these Max 7, these 7 companies are 33%, 1/3 of the S&P 500 index. So it's like these 7 companies are 1/3, and then the other 493 are 66%. So what the point where I'm getting and with your question is that these are not mere companies anymore. And the thesis that I'm working on is that these companies are building entire layers of markets and what I call digital land that doesn't really relate to the physical spaces. They move at will freely around the planet, interjecting themselves in elections, in trade discussions, and it's like an invisible hand. So one question that I have, and when Frank was talking about Elon Musk, is I have heard about, and we have all, about Elon Musk putting like 140 or 60 million, whatever, into supporting Trump on the election. But what I have not read or heard anywhere is, so he bought Twitter. So in the previous election, Twitter was controlled by, other people that actually kicked him out of the network. So he was not only in this network; he has his own network, and then he threw away all the rails in many of these things, and I'm sure that those algorithms were even more polarized. And so for me, one gigantic thing and one gigantic concern is that the center has been lost. And not only in the US, but in many of these other places. You see it in France, in Germany, and so on. And these corporations wield this gigantic power and end up pretty much determining the outcomes of so who are the candidates, and ultimately who gets elected, and so probably I'm more than giving answers. I'm throwing more questions into the space.
Frank, please.
Can I just jump on
Absolutely.
the war theme? And to technology. I talk a lot, and it's interesting, the major defense contractors in the United States, most of them have moved their headquarters from wherever they were right to Washington, D.C., and employing thousands of people. General Dynamics, right? It's just a perfect example of this. Because they are so reliant on the government for funding. So you get to know these people, and they are watching what is happening in Ukraine, and it is changing the future of war so fast they can't keep up. The simple fact is, from the use of tanks, which came into force in World War I, they're now effectively useless. That's the general consensus emerging by defense strategists. Tanks, because drones can just take them out. Right? They're big metal coffins. So what do? It's all about drones. And that Trump, weirdly, created Space Force in his first administration, which was sort of like, have you been watching too many Star Trek shows? What is this? Very interesting to see where that's going, right? I ran into one of these defense contractors the other day, and I've known him and his brother for years, and I said, how's your brother doing? He says, great, he's been working at Space Force there for a while. I said, what's he working on? Oh, they just finished the prototype of the flying armored personnel carrier. What? Yeah, no, it's like an armored personnel carrier, except it's mine-proof, and it can fly from anywhere from 5 feet off the ground to several hundred feet, and it can carry 20, 30 troops. That exists? Yes, that exists, right? So technology is a huge, and they're becoming more and more dominant, which is going to be a big issue, and we're seeing this, and I'll stop with this. Watch what the U.S. Justice Department is doing now to break up Google. There is a fear Google's listening. I'm not trying to offend, sorry. Right? Trying to spin off Chrome. And is the antitrust in the US and globally, do we now get these guys under control in some way?
Thank you.
So the name of the show he's talking about is on Apple TV called For All Mankind, with the armored personnel and the race for space race.
Question in the back on the left there, sir. Yes.
I wanted to ask, Choli
Mentioned
the game of theory and how that affects Taiwan, but he said at least twice assuming rational actors, and that ring a bell of me of what Andy Blocker mentioned about politics, Trump policy, and I would like to ask both of you, Andy and Cho, what do you think of the other about this situation in Taiwan? If you think that it's policies, politics, how micro-politics of personal people involved can affect this relationship of this game theory?
Yeah. You want to start or you want me to start?
I don't mind. I'll start.
Okay.
I think as far as my understanding of the Chinese stance is concerned, policy, politics, they've already merged it together. I see what Frank said earlier. Definitely, there's this very close correlation, especially these days even when you talk about economics, the economics and the economic data are lagging behind because politics goes first. Now, with regard to the Taiwan issue over China-US, when I said rational policy prevails, what I meant was, according to what I presented earlier, using that framework, the game theory framework, that each country try to predict and see what the next step of the other country, the component, or the opponent is going to move. Now, that's rational policy. That's rational thinking. What concerns me is, of course, irrational behavior, irrational response, which could come up with President Xi Jinping or President Trump. We don't know. That's something to do with their brains, right? But then, practically, the irrational move, from our view, could happen in a situation where it may not be irrational in somebody's thinking. The reason I said that is because that actually goes back to what Frank mentioned earlier, that he doesn't think Trump is a problem or whatever, which I'd agree. He thinks differently. And I wrote a couple of reports arguing that Trump is not irrational, Trump is not crazy. He is using a strategy which can also explain by game theory that he's not thinking along the lines that we think in terms of Nash equilibrium. Because that's all rational. You think, I move this step, you move that step, how can the two steps be matched? That's rational thinking. What he thinks is he goes all around, breaking out of the national equilibrium framework and drives for what game theory calls corner solution, i.e. winners takes all. That's him. So that is, from his perspective, everything that he acts, maybe President Xi Jinping, right? Whatever they act is rational. But when we look at it from outside, trying to analyze it, these are not rational. RMB devaluation, I keep arguing for years, is not a rational policy decision for the Chinese, and that's why they have not done it. They allow the RMB to depreciate but not devalue. There's a difference, right? Policy doesn't drive RMB to go down. So coming back to my point, that I am not ruling out what we see irrational policy response that could lead to an eruption point between China and US over Taiwan. It's still there, the possibility. But then the odds of that happening is low. Doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. So in financial market jargon, there's a tail risk.
Yeah.
But a tail risk carries a black swan event kind of risk as well.
Yeah, so great question. So if I'm going to put it in the rubric or the rubric of politics, Trump's policy in the macro and micro politics, I think a couple things. Number one is it's on the macro level, if you look at the US, when Trump came into office in 2017, 47% of the American people had a negative view of China. By the time he left office, 76% had a negative view of China. Today, 83% have a negative view of China. And that's why at the time of the transition between Trump and Biden, we said there's no political room on a macro political basis for Biden to withdraw the tariffs or to be seen as weak with China in any way, and that's what's taken place. He's just changed the strategy. He's been more multilateral in his thing. He's been more sanction-oriented, but he hasn't pulled back from the sanctions. So fast forward to today, that same rubric is there. And not only is it Trump, but it's also even more so the congressional Republicans who are even more hawkish with China. And that's the political world we live in. And then if you look over the side of Xi's side of the ledger, especially with the economy not moving at 5% GDP growth year over year, as it had been for decades, if he's not delivering on the economic side, he's got to deliver on the tussle with the US side. So he has to have the wolf warrior, at least within the domestic messaging. And so they both have to be seen as strong vis-a-vis the other. That is a macro political imperative. If you go to the micro political imperative, which is harder to predict, I think both figures are singular figures and are potential single points of failure or single points of success. And what I mean by that is, historically in China, you'd have the president, but you'd have a council of people that kind of work to make decisions together. Xi has consolidated all that power, and if he wants to do something, he gets to do it. Similarly, in the US, if you look at Donald Trump, part of this whole tussle about who gets nominated, where it's Matt Gaetz' Department of Justice or the Hegseth at Department of Defense, that's not what's going on. What's going on is he is trying to impose his will on the United States Congress, especially the United States Senate, to say, yes, you're supposed to be a check on my power. You are no check on my power. I own you. Okay, and so how this plays out will determine how much he has full control of the U.S. government without the need for detractors. So he becomes a single point of failure or success, depending on how he goes. So I can't get into their minds, but I think that, going back to what Frank has said and what you said, despite, and during the campaign, Trump said, I'm doing the weave, right? He said, I'm talking about this, and then I end up here, but I land right. And it's kind of his joke about how he's all over the place when he talks. But there is a little magic to the madness with Trump, and what I mean by that is he is pragmatic in certain ways. He's trying to do misdirection. He doesn't want you to see where he's going. But at the end of the day, he wants to accomplish things. And the question is, does he want to accomplish the actual result of changing the trade imbalance significantly toward the US? Or does he want the PR success of saying, I got A, B, C, D, I won, even though he kind of won but didn't really? And I don't know the answer to that question. Frank will know more. We can go to him now or later. But I do think that analysis is important to look at inside how they think about it. And I'm uncertain at this point on where he is on the bid-ask spread of some of the things he's done, whether it's immigration or tariffs or even conflict with China.
There was another question, just that gentleman right there, please. We'll come back to those on the right-hand side.
Yeah, I want to ask a question again on the matrix.
Speak up just a little bit, please.
It's not working.
Hello? I want to ask a question on the matrix, cooperation and war matrix that you.
I'm sorry, can't
the hear matrix. Louder.
The matrix.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. On the conflict with Taiwan, I think one of the way that I see it is that the way that the Chinese see the Taiwan has deeper cultural and historic repercussions for China than the way that the U.S. sees the conflict in Taiwan, because from a certain you mentioned the graph with the tech companies and so forth. The tech companies do not exist without TSMC, and if there is a hot war in Taiwan, as far as I know, everything that is inside a chip factory doesn't react well to bombs. So TSMC will basically cease to exist if there is a hot war in Taiwan. So I think part of your equilibrium rests on the fact that China knows that it cannot fight a hot war in Taiwan, and the outcome is basically not going to be a win. It's going to be a Pyrrhic victory, if at all, because the economic impact from Taiwan is going to be very small. I don't know if you agree with that. But I do have a question on the sanctions part. One of the things that we discussed a lot last year here in the conference was, as a consequence of the Ukraine war, the sanctions that were imposed in Russia, one of the deep concerns was weaponization of reserves. Do you think that that's an outcome that could be that we could see from the U.S. response to China, basically doing a blockade around Taiwan or something like that? Thank you.
Can I take a quick shot from a U.S. perspective?
Absolutely.
On Taiwan?
Please.
I've spent a lot of time on this for GWS and clients. I think the risk here for Taiwan is, for Beijing, is very much what we see with Russia, right? Is the sanctions threat, the tariffs threat. And Donald Trump even said this 2 weeks ago. President Xi is not going to invade Taiwan. If he does, he'll put 200% tariffs on everything, and I'll get the rest of the world to do it too. And I don't think that President Xi necessarily wants to go to war, but Nancy Pelosi opened the door for him to ratchet up pressure on Taiwan to talk about reunification. And he's not going to bring that down. He's just a smart politician. That's just the way it is. I think the risk in talking to Defense Department officials, I think it's relatively low in the next 5 years that you would see an invasion because of all of those issues. They talk very eloquently, and I totally agree in terms of the macroeconomics and the larger issues. I think the biggest fear factor, if you're President Xi or you're Joe Biden or even you're Donald Trump or any of the defense secretaries, is that 23-year-old sub-lieutenant who's flying, pick Taiwan or China, who presses the wrong button, who creates an international incident because he's now shot down a Taiwan fighter plane, or the Taiwanese have shot down a Chinese plane. And that you have all of these young people out there flying multi-billion-dollar aircraft, all of the maneuvering, the stuff. And I think the markets have gotten a little sanguine about this. They've gotten thinking this is some sort of ballet that is being performed. This is very dangerous stuff. This is why it was very important to watch what was going on between China and the Philippines and their coast guards in Scarborough Shores, right? What was happening? Ramming each other. No weapons were brought out, but they were using water jets. That could have escalated very quickly out of control. And where does everybody else, how do they respond? What would the US do? What would Japan do? What would South Korea do if you suddenly have a shooting war between the Philippines and China? So that is the risk. It's in the hands of some very young, aggressive men who you're trying to keep under control in the respective militaries. That's what I worry about, and I think that's what keeps a lot of people up at night. And the leadership, something happens that spirals all of this out of control.
Gee.
Thanks, Frank, for opening up a can of worms. I don't even know how to get back to the question. I remember this mentioning about TSMC. I do hear about that argument linking TSMC, tag, and China. You know, China needs TSMC and cannot really attack Taiwan because it destroys the company, then China won't benefit. That is true in the short term, meaning, I don't know, 3-4 years before China catches up with all this tech development. I alluded to in my presentation there that the Chinese have been working ultra fast, catching up very fast in the face of all these restriction obstacles to technological transfer, export restrictions, and so on. So to me, it's just a matter of time that China catches up and does not need TSMC at all. If you want to buy, from an investment perspective, buying TSMC today is still the right move. In the future, you buy SMIC, because TSMC may not exist anymore, as some of you alluded to. So the point here is that I don't think the tech angle and the company, TSMC, is that key in affecting or influencing the Chinese thinking about whether to take back Taiwan with force. And then I want to circle back a bit to what Andy mentioned earlier, to put things into perspective. Rational versus irrational response. If I understand what you said correctly, and also what I've read outside, is that both presidents, or president-elect in the US, President Xi in China, their primary focus is still domestic. Obvious, very obvious in China. But in the US, from my understanding of what Mr. Trump has been saying, America first and everything, bring jobs back to America, don't want to pay for other countries' defense expense and so on. It's all back to America. So from that perspective, the rational behavior response on policies of the two countries would be domestic. So if for some reason they change that policy direction and go external, foreign policy, fight war, and so on, so that would be the kind of irrational response or policy, in my thinking there. So that's the perspective. And then back to Frank, the reason why I said you opened up a can of worms because you brought in the Philippines and South China Sea, as if we had not enough problems already. I have a different thinking about the Chinese move against the Philippines, disputed waters, as opposed to the Chinese thinking about the Taiwan issue. I think the recent skirmishes, conflicts between China and the Philippines on the waters there, no weapons involved, is a typical foreign policy reaction to the fact that the Americans are now busy with Ukraine, busy with Middle East. You don't have much time for China, for Asia. Right? So because China claims, I have no proof, nobody has proof, but China claims those waters, those islands of the Philippines, of Vietnam are theirs. All right? So that's from their perspective that they would want to get back control. So that's the Chinese perspective. So when you see, as the Chinese government, that the American government now busy with something else, so I would do my pouring back to expand my influence, to establish my influence of the Philippine coast, of the Vietnam coast. This is what I see that the Chinese incentive in doing this in the past few months with the Philippines, and earlier with Vietnam. Now, once when the other tensions in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, cools down, America's policy refocus back to China, to Asia, I think China will stop doing it. But Taiwan is a different issue.
Believe me, believe President Xi Jinping, it is a red line. Do not cross it. Otherwise, we get into strategy number 4 that I talked about earlier, the red box. War and war, and then that means nuclear warheads.
Totally agree. I totally agree.
Annihilation of the human race.
Very different. We had a question on the right-hand side of the room.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thanks to the panelists for all the individual contributions and the broad stimulus on topics. We discussed micro, macro. We also had themes influencing policy, the tech industry, for instance. I want to throw another curveball to the panels, and that is climate financing. 3 years ago, we discussed how climate financing influences policy. I think we have now a discussion for 1 hour, and climate financing has not played a very vital role. So what are your views on what to expect in the foreseeable future on that topic? Thank you.
Let me kick it off and then kind of get the juices flowing. So thank you for that question, by the way. I think I just just touched on the fact that climate finance is under assault, and that is a function of the swing in politics, right, occurring across key parts of the world that you hoped would be advocates or champions for sustainability. I think on this particular subject, and particularly with respect to climate finance, it's been an embarrassment. It's been an embarrassment because if we go back in time, I believe it was 2016, developed countries, or the developed world, made a commitment to spend over $100 billion a year for a number of years to address sustainability and to almost help the developing world also catch up, right? Maybe build up their energy efficiency, renewable energy sources. And so that was the ideal. And I believe that it was only in 2022 that the United States finally got over their contribution. So that's why I say, you know what, a lot of talk, very little action. And I think on the side, you've had some activity on the private front, right? So, and we can go into all that, green bonds, blue bonds, you name it. And so you could say that that has been a very reassuring trend with respect to climate financing. But from the real ammo standpoint, the ammunition standpoint, where the real push has to come from government. Now, having said that, it means that governments have to not only be aware, but act on the fact that we have a major problem with climate. I know it's a very heavily politicized topic. I understand that. But the basics are there's a huge difference between the definition of weather and climate. So let's start there. I think some of those conversations have already started. I think there's great policy idea out there about what we should do to address some of the targets that have been talked about for quite some time, whether we get to 1.5 degrees Celsius, keep that average world temperature down. But you just haven't seen the follow through with respect to capital. And without that capital, and without that policy urgency, and especially in this environment now, where we would have expected the U.S. to continue leading its kind of like its push to more sustainability efforts, and that was baked into the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm sure you guys know very well what was that really contained with respect to climate. But in this environment, we're seeing now basically a step back, or maybe 2 steps back from the U.S. I have to say, and I apologize for the long-winded answer, but I have to say that the prospects for climate finance from the government side of the equation is going to be lacking. And that means that from the private side of the equation, we're going to have to find brand new actors, because there were some heavy hitters out there who came out strong and said, you know what, they're going to help in this effort and really make their mark in holding people accountable to sustainability targets. But even they, get swept up in the politics of the time, and that's fine. But that means that we need another generation of players to come in. They're out there. So even though I'm being a little bit pessimistic with respect to climate finance prospects from the public side, I think that the private side, there's a tremendous amount of capital that can be put to work. It's just a question of, well, how am I going to be paid back, right? That's just like the economics of that type of financing. But to see more concessional grants, to see more innovation in the private climate finance space, I think that's the future. That's where we all need to be. We need to be focused on. So I just wanted to kind of make that high-level commentary. If there's anyone else who wants to add, please.
Yeah, if I, well, many thanks for the question, Marco, and I wanted to ask about talking about things that we have not spoken about. So I'm concerned about the changes that we will see in the agenda of this new administration on climate.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, we know that it has not been very positive in that sense, so that's concerning. And also on defense and security, talking about NATO, talking about obviously Ukraine, Israel, Iran, and the like. So we have spoken, reasonably so about China and the like, but there are all these pockets of I mean, NATO itself would and stepping out of the COP climate initiatives and the like. Those will be transformational things. The signal that the U.S. would be giving by stepping out and taking support away from those. So I do have questions on those.
Yeah.
Please, Andy.
So let me start with the climate question and pivot to what Iker just said. So if I there's a couple things. Number one is that if we look about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like I was talking about before, is that yes, the good thing is that even in the U.S., people believe climate change is real.
Mm-hmm.
Even the majority of Republicans think it's real today. But it's not real today,
mm-hmm.
in a existential way. And so when you're faced with economic and other choices today, can I buy that loaf of bread, or can I worry about climate change, or can I have a job? They're going to pick the job and the loaf of bread. You move to Europe, which has been much more pro-climate. You have the Russia-Ukraine war, which totally upset the apple cart on energy and where we're going to get it. And Germany has to retool from natural gas to coal plants, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can see how those fundamental needs in the immediate supersede the long term. And so I think as long as countries are at the risk of war and at the risk of economic decline, climate's not going to get there.
Mm-hmm.
It's only when we're in a more prosperous and safer environment can climate rise to the top. In the US, we have a situation where there was a big movement amongst more of the liberal groups, and then there was a pushback. So I like to talk about in physics, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, in politics, for every action, there's an unequal, disproportionate overreaction. And so that the anti-climate, anti-ESG is like,
mm-hmm.
Some of the actors in our industry who were out there, they are now the poster child for the one trying to take away your job. And really, it's really critical to understand that the only way you match these different incentives is if you don't talk about the parade of horribles, you talk about the transition. The moment that labor and environmentalists get together, right, and not be, labor says we don't want any automation, I think Frank was saying on the board, or the environmentalists say we just want everything we want, we don't care, you just deal with it on the labor side. You have to have someone just like we did with the trade and trade liberalization. We hollowed out America as we lost all our manufacturing. We didn't have any place for them to go. Same thing with environment. You need to deal with environment in a political context of what is possible and what will continue to feed your country.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not, you're being impractical, and your politics will not match, and it will not sustain. So going back to what you, so I want to just real quick, just because I want to come to you, Frank, but not to be disrespectful, Iker. That's the same thing within NATO, within Middle East. All these things are just bigger, and we can talk about it later, but Frank, you want to talk?
I would say on the climate thing, just from a U.S. perspective, I would argue the last 4 years, the Biden administration made 3 critical mistakes. One, they engaged in scare tactics. It's the end of the world. We're all going to melt down. What am I supposed to do? I live in Cleveland, Ohio. I try and recycle. What more do you want me to do? That was and so instead of scare tactics, talk about opportunity. What this means to your kids, because your kid can grow up and become Elon Musk and create the largest electric car company in the world and be a multi-billionaire. Okay, that's Elon Musk is the perfect example. He's not out there talking about climate, he's just doing it, right? That's the first thing. The second thing was it became a top-down government issue pressed on businesses. I remember at one point the US Securities and Exchange Commission was contemplating regulations that would require all publicly traded companies to file not only their carbon footprint, but then also the footprint of all of their suppliers. What? What a waste of time and money. Why does my company have to now be policing all of my contractors? And what does stop, right? This is negative. And then the third thing I would argue with the Biden administration was just incompetence. And I use that word judiciously. This is the Biden administration that I think it was something like 10 billion, I can't remember how many billions of dollars by the year 2030 to build 500,000 charging stations for electric cars. This is legislation that's passed 3 years ago. Do you know how many electric charging stations they've built? 8. 8. Get out of the way. Why is the government doing this? Right? I'm listening to a radio program the other day talking about I'm not making this up, a new psychological problem, anxiety that Americans have. It's called destination anxiety. And they're finding it with people with electric cars because they can't go where they want to go because they're afraid they're going to run out of energy and there'll be no charge. It's like, come on, right? Turn this over to the private sector. Let's create 100 new Elon Musks. Let's just figure this out and just keep moving, right? And get the government out of here and stop scaring people. Show the opportunity, not the fears. And I think that's going to be the big shift here, I would predict, certainly under Trump. And you will even see this in Europe. You'll see this under a new German government. You'll hear it from Meloni more and more in Italy. Watch for this. It's the opportunity because it fits in with the whole tech expansion. It is one and the same.
Chi, any comments on this particular question? Because I know that if you call up a couple of articles, people say, oh, China, huge emission, CO2 emission country, when in fact it's really the developed world that's got the bulk of CO2 emissions under their belt. But obviously China is a big growth story. Walk us through how you're seeing things on this topic.
Well, we have specialized teams and analysts on the issue.
Yep.
So I pretend to know something, so that's all I can share within the next minute or two. China does have an incentive, probably bigger than many other countries, to get into climate control, because it's a victim of climate control. Deserts are spending, arable lands are decreasing very quickly. They need food. They need irrigation. There's a lot of infrastructure spending in China, redirecting water from the south to the north to the east to the west, just trying to redistribute all those natural resources so that it can grow a bit more instead of relying too much on imports of agricultural products and so on. So I have a very strong impression that China does want to do the climate control thing, and they mean it very seriously. And if I remember it correctly, and if the number is still right, China is the largest green bond issuer in the world, I think, and it still is. Right? So there's government incentive there. I have another observation that I can share quickly is that there is, I think some of us alluded to earlier, that there's a different attitude towards climate control, ESG, between Europe and North America or the rest of the world. Being with a European bank, I feel that ESG enthusiasm. We've been decarbonizing our portfolios and even China portfolio
I'm amazed when our lead PM told me that he's successfully decarbonized China portfolio. I said, how can it be? I mean, China is still growing. It still needs to burn a lot of coal and stuff. But the point here is that I think European mindset is more pro-ESG, pro-climate control versus other parts of the world, other players. And from a practical perspective, you know who to go to if you want to go with the ESG portfolio.
Thank you for the question. There was a gentleman right here.
Hi, my name's Virgil Mendoza from Northern Trust. I completely agree with what Frank said in his introduction, that the next 4 years will be all about politics. So my question is about politics. I think Trump wants to make America great again, and you can't accomplish that in 2 years. His ego will not allow him to just walk off into the sunset after 4 years. So I don't think the next 4 years will be all about the first 2, but I think the last 2 will be about him ensuring that his legacy endures and that probably he remains the puppet master behind whoever fronts the Republican Party for the 28 election. So my question is going to be, who are the runners and riders that we ought to keep an eye on? Vance seems an obvious choice, but it may not be the right one. And what do we need to watch out for to understand the tea leaves? In other words, what Trump might be doing to ensure that people he can control are the nominees for the Republican Party. Do any of his children have political ambitions?
You want me to jump in? Yeah, I think Vance, absolutely. I agree. Trump is not going to go away. There's no doubt of it. I think the question is, does populism begin to diminish? And I think with a stronger economy, I think we are here in a populist state in the U.S., as we've seen with Nigel Farage in England and the AfD in Germany. A lot of this is economically driven, meaning going back to the 2008 financial crisis, that people felt disenfranchised, the government didn't protect them, whatever, right? And created two polarizing views of government. I think the only way you heal that is if you have a sustained economic growth that people feel more comfortable, and they more naturally then begin gravitating to the center, right? They become less angry. So where are we in 2 years? Where are we in 4 years? How relevant is Trump at that point? That's a big question. Nobody knows. But that's the first thing I'm going to be watching. The second thing is, yes, it's clearly going to be J.D. Vance, but Trump is going to make sure that there's a competition, and he's going to make sure that somebody's aligned with him and is truly loyal to him. But there's a lot of other very interesting Republicans there. There's J.D. Vance. I point to Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia. He's the former co-CEO of the Carlyle Group. Extremely impressive politician. There's any number of senators who could jump into this. Governors, there's, I think Sarah Huckabee Sanders, his former spokesperson, who is now the governor of Arkansas, is going to run for president. So I think there's a huge number of people jockeying already for that. And those campaigns, believe it or not, have actually started very quietly. Because, again, you don't have to compete with Trump. You just have to please him and grab that. So let's see how that plays out.
If I may ask just one short but non-minor question. Trump will be ending this term as the oldest ever sitting president. Is health and age an issue? And how in this dimension this is likely to evolve, and even will he make it to the end or not? And if he does not, what happens?
He's not a health food eater, right? He's not eating yogurt and granola every day, and his lunch is not a salad. If anybody's seen his diet, did anybody see the picture of him the other day on his jet?
Yeah, with
McDonald's. That's not a joke. He loves it, right? He has a burned hamburger almost every day for lunch. I don't know how he keeps going, but I think it's a huge potential issue.
Hey, guys. He's the healthiest president ever. No, I mean, yeah, I think going to both questions, I think he is, in my estimation, I think I said this term before, I feel like he's a singular figure. And what I mean by that is that he's not just president, he's a celebrity president. And he can do things others can't because people can simultaneously take him seriously but not take him literally. And so, and they can choose when they do it based on, the other thing is that he's immune from most of these attacks. We're talking about all this stuff about his nominations right now, and Gates and Hegspeth, all these different people. This will not be a story 3 months from now. This will have no impact on how he's viewed. People want someone who's willing to go into the fire, take on the standard press and the criticism and plow through to get stuff done for them. And the reason he's able to do that is because while a regular politician, if you get a bad news story, you're running from it, you're trying to get it off the front page. If you're Donald Trump and you get a bad news story, you're in the news. It's celebrity, you're relevant. Yes, you drive through it, or you just, oh, you thought that was bad? Here's another bad story. And you're not thinking about the first one anymore. And then, and eventually he'll land on a good story. But he's immune to that, guys. And the minute we recognize that, because he's been in the American people's living rooms for 40 years in different ways. And so I don't think other Republican politicians are going to be able to use the same tactics he does. If J.D. Vance does the same thing, he's considered mean and whatever. But Trump is immune to that. So it'll be interesting to see the transition. Maybe some of his populist policies will transform or translate to the next generation. But his extra belligerence, I think some people want a little belligerence. They want a little bit of trolling the other side. But he does it extra. And I don't think they'll be able to get away with it. That's just my opinion.
I think Andy's totally right. And to your question, I didn't answer, and I'm going to bet you agree with me. Maybe his kids try and do something, but they're not his father. I'm not saying that to be direct. They just don't have that 40 years of experience. We don't really know them. They've never been elected to anything. We don't know what they do all day, right? I mean, I hear Ivanka Trump may want to run for governor or senator or something in Florida, but I have a feeling this is it. We're done with the Trump political legacy on a national stage.
We have time for one more question. Who's the lucky questionnaire?
Victoria.
Where's Victoria?
She's right there. She has a question.
She does. No. No one else? Everyone is happy? Everyone's satisfied? Yes? All right, I have one last question for the panel then. Since we did our word cloud exercise, and now I have the four of you here. Iker, what keeps you up at night?
Well, one thing that...
In one sentence.
Sorry?
In one sentence, what keeps you up at night?
Trump?
Wow, that's one word.
That's one word. Frank?
My wife, because I live on a farm, she's the farmer. She wakes me up because she can hear the chickens in the middle of the night. She tells me to go get the gun because the fox is in the hen house. It happens all the time. I never sleep anymore.
Wow, I love that.
Wow.
Chi, what keeps you up at night?
The questions that you just asked.
There you go.
I have to think about the answer.
All
Too
this
many
stuff,
things. But
right.
one word still, we saw it in the beginning, the quiz day already, geopolitics.
Andy?
I like the my wife one, but I'm not going to go down that
Taken.
path. No, I'm going to be a little bit more serious. I think what Frank talked about with respect to these young men flying these fighter jets and something popping off and then it lights a match and we got on a path we can't get off. And so hopefully the two governments, at least U.S. and China, will continue to have those economic and military conversations so that if something like that happens, they can avert the existential.
Right. And then just to ask myself the question, my answer is a little bit more aspirational. I think about, when I look at my girls, and I think about their friends, I just wonder if we have a next generation of leadership that really cares about everything that we're talking about here, ready and willing and able to bring some real solutions. That's something that I aspire, and think about, and I hope happens. So with that, I want to thank my panel here, Andy Blocker, Chi Lo, Frank Kelly, and my esteemed colleague, Iker. Thank you for being here. Thank you all for paying attention. Let's all have a tremendous lunch and an awesome rest of the day.
Thank you. Excellent. So, well, we're going to be moving for lunch. It's right outside, and we will reconvene at 2 p.m. Anything else we should know? Okay, so thank you so much, and let's get ready for